Hello, hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Glad you're with us. We are having a Monday evening chat. Plenty of conversation, plenty of things to converse about. As usual, we really appreciate it if you hit the like button, if you hit the subscribe button, if you send us a super chat. I will answer it. May not give you the answer that you want, but I will give you an answer if you send me a super chat. If you post this on Reddit, on Facebook, make it a bigger conversation. That's always appreciated. The more fun, the merrier. Good times for all. I see people piling in. We're going to do our little introductory segment as everyone pours in. Then we'll do our roll call, and I'll call you out as I see you. But yes, folks, now is the time. If you haven't hit the like button, if you haven't hit the subscribe button, if you haven't hit the notifications bell, hit that notifications bell. I know a lot of people don't get notifications. Well, make sure you get the notifications by hitting the notifications bell. Make sure that you're subscribed. And make sure that you're subscribed. I understand that there are mysterious things in the YouTube algorithm where people get unsubscribed mysteriously. So to make sure that that doesn't happen to you, I'm a little off center there. To make sure that doesn't happen to you, now is the time. Now is the time to make sure that you're subscribed. Make sure you get the notifications. I'm just going on and on and on about this. Folks, a name that is on the minds of many progressive-minded people right now is Tara Reade. I don't know if people know about Tara Reade, but I hope you do. I hope there's been enough publicity about it. Mainstream media would like you to not know who Tara Reade is, but Tara Reade worked in the office of Joe Biden in the early 90s. She described a sexual assault that was done to her, and mainstream media ignored it. Mainstream media has tried to obscure it. And now, the latest argument of mainstream media about why Tara Reade should not be taken seriously is because she praised Russian President Vladimir Putin. Now, folks, do you recall the Brett Kavanaugh hearings where all kinds of things were said about the woman who accused now Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh? All kinds of things were said about the woman who made that accusation, and the response of Democrats was, it doesn't matter. Right? If she has ties to the CIA, it doesn't matter. If she has ties to the Democrats, it doesn't matter. Right? You listen to an accuser. You take an accuser seriously. Well, Tara Reade is an accuser. She is an accuser. She has come forward. She has a credible story. And mysteriously, the phone call into Larry King of her relative has been removed. Gold standard. All right. Gold standard written down. It seems like the establishment is lined up to obscure her. And Bill Maher, disgusting Bill Maher, has decided that, she praised Russian President Vladimir Putin, so she shouldn't be taken seriously. And that line seems to be the line of a lot of the mainstream Democrats. She shouldn't be taken seriously because she praised Russia's President Vladimir Putin. She wrote something praising him, calling him charismatic, saying he was, charming to women and children or whatnot. And because of that, she shouldn't be believed. And this fits in with a big, big bias. We saw how for Victory Day, the celebration of the victory over fascism in World War II, Facebook was repressing people that put up, the symbol, the Soviet hammer-sickle flag over Berlin, the Reichstag being liberated by Soviet troops. That photograph just so happened to be flagged on Victory Day. People got their accounts, turned off. They were barred from posting. They said it was offensive to post the historical photograph of Soviet troops liberating the Reichstag. So there you go, right? There is an anti-Russian bias in American media. There is a new McCarthyism, and it accompanies the new McCarthyism against China. The notion that China is somehow responsible for the pandemic. the notion that China is somehow to blame for all of the problems that we're having. We noticed, I don't know if people noticed today, Donald Trump was giving a press conference, and he was asked by a reporter about COVID-19, and he was boasting that the United States had the best response of any country. No country has as good of a response as we do. And this reporter asked him simply, is it a contest? And he replied, why don't you ask China that? She persisted, and then Trump he was out of there. It was kind of like South Park. Screw you guys, I'm going home. Is that South Park? It was like, screw you guys, I'm going home, something like that. I don't remember. I didn't watch South Park regularly growing up, but I think that was a running gag. I think it was one of the South Park characters would get mad and he would say, screw you guys, I'm going home. Right? I had a college professor in college. He did that one time. We were having a conversation in the college class. I think it was an introductory government course or politics class. And I remember we were talking about the issue of racism, and he was talking about the show, the Bill Cosby show, and my professor said, he pointed out, he said, you'll notice that the Huxtables, the way they were an upper middle class family, they didn't have the conditions that average African Americans had, at which point there was a student in my class, I'll never forget this, who said, who started doing his impression of Bill Cosby's, the Jell-O Jigglers advertisement. At which point my college professor was just so frustrated that his class couldn't pay attention or wouldn't follow him. He said, you know what, freshmen, you can entertain yourselves this afternoon. And he stormed out of the room. I'll never forget that. You can entertain yourselves. He said, screw you guys, I'm going home, just like Donald Trump. Oh boy, folks. These are wild times. Before we get into our roll call and I acknowledge people, I see that Jason Unruhe is in the chat. Shout out to Jason. He's got a very big YouTube channel. He's been making Marxist YouTube videos for a long time, a lot longer than I have. I thought we would have a little bit of fun because, I have a love-hate relationship with The Economist. I'm stuck at home. I'm working from home. So The Economist magazine, the free market neoliberal publication from the London School of Economics, it comes in the mail and, it has some academic data in it. It gives you the line of that Joe Biden Eastern Establishment, British, Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes Round Table wing of the international capitalist class. It gives you the London Stock Exchange, Wall Street perspective on things. It's not the Trump perspective, but it's neoliberal free market globalism. I just thought I might have some fun here because, they have this section called This Week in Politics. This Week in Politics. And I just thought, there's a couple of things that stand out, and I'll read you what they said, and then I'll tell you the full story. Right? So this is just highlights from This Week in Politics. All right. The World This Week in Politics from The Economist with interpretation from Caleb Maupin. Khalifa Haftar, the warlord battling the government in Libya, declared military rule in the east. General Haftar hopes to become Libya's strongman. Opinion on Venus Project, writing it down. He hopes to become Libya's strongman. Venus Project. Hopes to become Libya's strongman, but he is on the back foot after recent losses to the West. The real story being, hasn't regime change worked out so well in Libya? Those Libyan people were suffering so much under Gaddafi. I mean, they had the highest life expectancy on the African continent, guaranteed health care, guaranteed education, universal employment. Gaddafi had built the world's biggest irrigation system, built big universities. Everyone who got married got $20,000 when they got married, which is a lot more money in Libya. And, there was a very prosperous place. He was talking about setting up an independent African currency. Oh, the people were just so horrifically oppressed. And then the great Western capitalist powers invaded. Thank goodness. They sent cruise missiles. They sent armed terrorist groups and al-Qaeda fighters. They launched a social media campaign saying that he had a Russian girlfriend and that Gaddafi was not a true Muslim or something like that. And they tore Libya apart, and now they're free. They're so free, they don't even have a strong central government. They're so free, parts of the country don't even have electricity. They're so free that al-Qaeda and ISIS have set up shop. The story that's not in The Economist, the story that should be there, is that regime change has been a disaster in Libya. That when Libya was a socialist country, it was prosperous. And now that Libya has joined the global free market capitalist system, it has been wrecked. It has been destroyed. Things have gotten so bad in Libya since it became a capitalist country, since it started doing business with Wall Street and London. Things have gotten so bad in Libya that people drown in the Mediterranean trying to escape from what capitalism has brought to Libya. That's the real story there. You don't see that in The Economist. Next one. This is from this week in The Economist. Saudi Arabia said it would no longer execute people who committed crimes when they were children. It also banned flogging as punishment, but the beheadings continue. 184 people were put to death last year, a record for the kingdom. That's right, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the only country in the world that still executes people by cutting their heads off in public. And Saudi Arabia is the #1 ally of the United States in the Middle East, right? Let me give you the lowdown. What are the countries the United States doesn't like in the Middle East? Well, you have the Syrian Arab Republic. You have the Islamic Republic of Iran. Now, U.S. media contends, well, these countries are not really democracies, blah, 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 blah. Saudi Arabia is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. It does not pretend to be a democracy. It makes no pretension of being a democracy. It is an autocratic state. Every person and everything in the country is the property of the Saudi royal family. It is an autocratic dictatorship, and it makes no apologies for being a dictatorship, and it cuts people's heads off in public for disagreeing with it. You can get the death penalty in Saudi Arabia for insulting the king or for practicing sorcery. Those are things that people are regularly executed for. There was a case where I believe there was a woman from Indonesia, a guest worker. I think she was a nanny or a domestic worker of some kind, and she was accused of having, killed a child. And she said she was innocent. They didn't care, without even asking the government of Indonesia, without even saying anything to the government of Indonesia, the government where this woman came from. They publicly cut her head off. It was awful. She was screaming out, "I didn't kill, I'm innocent," as they were, removing her head from her shoulders. Saudi Arabia is an autocratic, barbaric society. It is backward. It is primitive. It was created, the House of Saud, the British Empire, found them during the 1930s when they were discovering oil, and they said, these are our guys. They gave them weapons, they gave them guns, and they have made sure that the peninsula, right, the Arabian Peninsula remains underdeveloped. There's oil and sand there. And this is the ally of the United States. So whenever you hear the United States talking about human rights in Iran, human rights in Syria, I mean, I'm sorry, look at who they're supporting. Look at who they're supporting. I mean, you can't get more blatantly hypocritical than this. Billions of dollars of weapons are sold to the Saudis. They have the 4th largest military budget of any country in the world. Billions of dollars of U.S.-made weapons, profits for weapons manufacturers. The big 4 super major oil companies have almost an exclusive monopoly. Chevron, BP, Shell Oil, and ExxonMobil are in there doing business. Trump goes there and he dances with the king, the guy that people get their heads cut off for insulting. They just allowed women to drive last year, right? So this year, they won't be cutting people's heads off for something they did when they were a kid, right? If you do it after you're 18, they'll cut your head off. But they won't cut off the head of anybody who did something when they were a kid, and no public floggings. No public floggings, right? So enlightened, right? So advanced, All kinds of articles about how the new crown prince of Saudi Arabia the crown prince is such a reformer, such a visionary. Meanwhile, in Syria, where they protect religious minorities, where they have communist parties that are legal, where they have trade unions and factories, that's unacceptable. Where they have internationally monitored elections, multiple parties, dictatorship. Iran, where you have elections, where you have Christians and Muslims, you have the different religious groups, you have different political parties in Iran, you have, no, that's unacceptable. Can it be any more obvious? Right? All the countries that are enemies of the United States in the Middle East have been the most progressive. The Republic of Iraq under Saddam Hussein, Ba'athist Arab socialism, building infrastructure, trying to raise people out of poverty. Libya under Gaddafi, right? Syria, Iran, right? Egypt, the United States worked very, very hard to topple Abdel Nasser, the Arab socialist leader who built the Aswan Dam, this huge hydroelectrical project, the man who brought electricity to Egypt. That's who the United States worked against. And who are the allies of the United States in the Middle East? Wahhabis, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the autocracy of Kuwait, the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Every reactionary autocracy that keeps its country an impoverished, desert-filled oil plantation. That's who the allies of the United States are, the United Arab Emirates. I mean, the hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy should never be, I mean, no one does a double take. No one does a double take. I was at the UN. I was at the UN reporting when the previous king, King Salman of Saudi Arabia, died. And I remember Samantha Power, Miss Human Rights, the genocide chick, got up and commemorated, the king of Saudi Arabia, and talked about how he had a scholarship program and he let women study in the United States. Oh, so kind. She gets up and, calls for the destruction of Syria. She, sells war like crazy. But the king of Saudi Arabia had a scholarship program. Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN Secretary General, he got up and he said, this is a wise, compassionate leader who happens to cut people's heads off and has ties to Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups and is bombing Yemen and killing thousands of people and violating international law. Yeah, I mean, the hypocrisy. I'm sorry. Say what you want. All right, Australia, break U.S. hegemony. Writing it down. Say what you want. Criticize Iran, criticize Syria, criticize Gaddafi, criticize Saddam Hussein. Do that all you want. But do not tell me for a minute that U.S. foreign policy is about human rights. It's about protecting innocent people. This is a load of propaganda. And if you don't realize that by now, something's wrong with you. Next, from The Economist. The IMF has agreed to provide $3.4 billion in emergency funding to Nigeria, its biggest disbursement related to COVID-19 so far. Nigeria faces a shortage of foreign currency after the collapse of the oil price. Folks, after the destruction of Libya in 2011, Libya had been the top oil exporting country in Africa. Now, the top oil exporting country in Africa is Nigeria. And the people of Nigeria, despite living in the country that is the richest in all of Africa, the Niger Delta region produces so much oil, right? The beaches, are black with oil because there's so many oil spills. The air there is heavily polluted because there's constant oil fires. The Niger Delta region, the richest part of the African continent at this point in terms of natural wealth. No part of the African continent makes as much money as the Niger Delta region does for Western capitalists. The people there are dirt poor. The people there live in some of the most extreme poverty. Go to the CIA World Fact Book. Don't take my word for it. Go to the CIA World Fact Book and look up Nigeria. Look at the rate of poverty in Nigeria. Look at the rate of literacy in Nigeria. That's ability to read on a basic elementary school level. Look at the rate of infant mortality in Nigeria. Nigeria should be an amazing, prosperous country, right? It's doing business. It's part of the capitalist system. It's doing business with Western capitalism, foreign investment, IMF, World Bank, free market loans. Nigeria should be prosperous. Libya shouldn't have been prosperous under Gaddafi because that's socialism, and everyone knows socialism creates poverty. Nigeria, the IMF free market regime that buys lots of U.S. weapons and has had American oil companies doing business with it for decades and decades and decades, had U.S.-backed military dictators in the 80s. Now one of those military dictators is now elected as President Buhari. Nigeria should be the prosperous country of the region, right? Nigeria, because it exports so much oil, it's the richest country. It has the most natural resources. It's got minerals. It's got natural gas. Nigeria should be the wealthiest place. But Nigeria is not. Nigeria has frequent food shortages, malnutrition, lack of basic education, child labor. Read about Nigeria. If you think capitalism is the answer to raising people out of poverty, look at Nigeria. And the fact that right now, because of the oil price drop, because of COVID-19 and the global slowdown in the economy, because of that, the IMF is desperately trying to bail out the people of Nigeria. They're starving. They are absolutely miserable. That's what Western free market capitalism has to offer. And that's not what you'll read in The Economist. And one more while we're at it, just for the fun of it, right? Kim Jong-un, North Korea's dictator, remained invisible. He has not been seen in public since April 11th, prompting speculation that he is sick. America and South Korea said they saw no sign of anything unusual. Mr. Kim is the third generation's hereditary rule of supposedly communist state. He has not been publicly seen. Yeah. Oops. Whoops. Remember that? I mean, a couple weeks, people were all saying on here, hey, Caleb, what do you think about Kim Jong-un? I said, give it time. Give it time. Give it time. We'll know. I have a feeling that a lot of what we hear about North Korea is fake news. And I said that. I said a lot of what we hear about North Korea is fake news. This issue of The Economist that I'm having here was printed before Kim Jong-un made his public appearance. And it was clear that he was not sick, that nothing had happened. And I kid you not, right? There is an entire article in here. I'm going to find it for you in just a second. I mean, it's you can't make this up. You want to talk about bias? Oh, leader, where art thou? There's a whole article in here speculating that Kim Jong-un might be dead or might be sick or might be having surgery. And it was all malarkey. It was all fake news. Folks, I remember I was in Washington, D.C., and I often will ask people on the street, their opinion. That's kind of a thing I do. Vox Pops, you ask people on the street their opinion. And I remember there was a fellow, kind of a bigger guy, and I remember I asked him his opinion about whatever was going on. And then he said, what news agency are you with? I told him what news agency he was with. He said, is that fake news? And I did a double take. And I thought, fake news? Is that like fake New Jersey, fake Wisconsin? And then I realized he meant fake news. It was just kind of that North Carolina Southern accent where it's like is it North Carolina, South Carolina, where they say fike instead of fake, right? So yeah, it took me a minute. Is that fake news? I thought he said F-I-K-E, fake news. But yes, it was fake news. The idea that Kim Jong-un was dead, had surgery, was fake news. He was social distancing. He was doing what leaders are supposed to do in this situation. He was not going out, right? And they started rumors. And I said in my radio interview, and I've said before, I speculate that something was afoul with these rumors. These weren't just rumors, right? I speculated that something was going on. What is this? Right. All right. Roll. All right. And folks, I think before we go to our roll call, I just want to read you a quote from Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates is the wife of Bill Gates. Bill Gates was at one point listed as the richest man in the world, founder of Microsoft. He's supposed to be a genius. And we would assume that his wife, Melinda Gates, is also a genius. But folks, you don't have to be smart to be rich. Many people are smart and not rich, and many rich people are very dumb. And this is the quote I want to read you from Melinda Gates. Melinda Gates had this to say, quote, when I go to Malawi, Tanzania, or Senegal, they all want to live in America. We are lucky to live here. They want to live in these type of capitalistic societies. We just need to tune in and get it right. Folks, Malawi, Tanzania, and Senegal are all capitalist countries. So what sense does this make? When I go to capitalist Malawi and capitalist Tanzania and capitalist Senegal, they all want to live in capitalist America. Maybe that's because capitalist America is wealthier. Maybe that's because capitalist America is the country that owns all the businesses that dominate the markets of capitalist Malawi, capitalist Tanzania, and capitalist Senegal. I mean, it's like, can she be this stupid? Shouldn't she really be this stupid? I mean, this is the wife of a man who was at one point the richest person in the world, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I mean, When I go to Malawi, Tanzania, or Senegal, they all want to live in America. We are lucky to live here. They all want to live in these type of capitalistic societies. We just need to tune in and get it. Of course, people in poorer capitalist countries want to move to wealthier capitalist countries. What in the world? Huh? This is like, again, I've dealt with this my whole life. There are people that think that communist country means poverty. They're like, I went to El Salvador and it's communist. The people there are poor. No. Third world that's the level of ignorance, right? Malawi, Tanzania, and Senegal can't be capitalist because they're poor. It's beyond me. All right, a super chat just went by. I want to write it down so I don't miss it. Can someone repeat it? Because I missed it. It went by pretty fast, so I don't want to miss it. Don't want to miss it. Communism means everything bad. Exactly. I mean, it's just like that's what Melinda Gates thinks, right? That she listed a bunch of poor African countries, and all of them they all want capitalism. Capitalists exploit the third world in depth. I am confused exactly how Nigeria and other countries are so poor. All right, capitalists exploit the third world. All right, folks. So I gave you my lowdown on the Economist and Melinda Gates and her lovely interview. So now is the time, folks. I'm going to take a sip, a sip of orange juice. And now is the time. If you haven't hit the like button, hit that like button. If you haven't hit the subscribe button, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're still subscribed. Hit the bell and start giving me your names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Who is with us tonight? Who's enjoying the party? We're just getting started. Dylan from Worcester, Massachusetts. Elias from Lancaster, Wisconsin. Space Communist from Corona, California. Jack Dundee from the United Kingdom. No War But Class War in West Virginia. Elon Musk from Alcatraz. Ken from Connecticut. Australia here high. Michael from Long Beach, California. Daniel Madruga from Portugal. Jenny from Cincinnati. Rose from New York City, Brooklyn. Joe from Kalamazoo, Michigan. Akeem from the Netherlands. Hey, Caleb, I want to buy technology. Liverpool, UK. New York City Communist. Georgia. Driving through Texas storms, says Huey Long. Calvin from Saskatoon. Tom from Southern California. Marissa in Buffalo. Pomona, California. Jason Ruhe is in Niagara Falls. And slowly I turned, and step by step, inch by inch. Old TV joke. Wow, they're going by fast. Pennsylvania, USA. Jay from Philly. Steo from Dublin, Ireland. Jared from Massachusetts. Shaniqua from Buffalo. Staten Island. Harry, Spain. Dan from Wilmington. Leftism Today from Riverside, California. Logan from Ohio. Patty from Cucamonga, says Kinky. Cucamonga, that's California, right? Minnesota here. Maryland. Georgia, says Chan. Phoenix, Arizona. Memphis. Will DeMarco, says Jason. Shreveport. Joe from Maryland. My grandfather worked in Niagara Falls. Ron from St. George, Utah. Earth, says Jerry Alatalo. Robert, Hawaii. Frank in Baltimore. Sami from UK. Someone says from a communist future Mars colony. Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Fresno, California, says Will. Phoenix, Arizona, says nickname. Northern Michigan, says A. Clark. Richard Bruce says, where did you learn to speak so well? Mike Bendito says, bro. Box Spite says he's in the Philippines. Max Hessen says Boston. Charlotte, North Carolina, says Lincolnite Yankee. I spent a long time in Charlotte a long time ago. Down Under, says Swazzer Productions. Red Planet, says Bungie. Brian Schaefer says Illinois. Brian Schaefer in Illinois. Hi from Northern Virginia. Alex from Southern California. Very red state. Driving in Texas, says Huey Long. Thumbs up for Caleb, please, says Mose H. How do you like me now, says Sam. Bing from part of China known as Taiwan. Mose H from southern Iraq. Nick Huntington from Beach, California. George Kraft from Texas. Alex Giovanni in Salem, Oregon. Salem, Oregon. Better than Salem, Massachusetts, right? Went there when I was a kid. Kind of a tourist attraction. Caleb, you're the best, says Kami from Hawaii. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Kami from Hawaii. I'm glad you appreciate me. I know there's people watching in many different time zones. Callie Fornat, hey folks, says Nathaniel P. Adams. England here, says Johnny Squidbron. Have you got any thoughts on popular debates among soc Dems? Julian from Texas. Los Angeles, says Sam. Sam, that's a long last name. I don't want to butcher it. Sam in Los Angeles. What's my opinion on Doritos? Michael Brooks, says Marissa. Right? Names and locations, folks. If I haven't called you out, just throw it in again. I want to make sure everyone knows that they are heard. I'm being asked what I think of Tito. I assume you do not mean Tito of the Jackson 5. You mean Tito, the leader of socialist Yugoslavia. I can probably answer that at some point in the live tonight. Names and locations. If you haven't posted this around, now is the time to do it. Nate from Sydney, Australia. Make this a Facebook status, tweet this out, post it on Reddit. Vicksburg, Pennsylvania, or Mississippi, JT24. Patrick from Attica, New York. Captain Squid. Right? Jenny from Australia. People are power. Welcome, Jenny. Glad you're with us. Michael Epstein in Manhattan. Glad you're with us, Michael. Good times for all. Alrighty. Big streams are gradually getting bigger with everyone, says Jack Rabbit, and you're absolutely right about that. Grant Jarvis says, don't bother with town, but Australia. All right, Grant, I trust you're in a good part of Australia. Many Australian fans of the show. Right? Parker from California. Jason Unruh says, Jeffrey Epstein from hell. From hell. That's the letter of Jack the Ripper, signed from hell, the infamous from hell letter. Right? Very famous. Right? Okay, folks. So I have some super chats to get through. The gold standard was the first one. The gold standard. The gold standard was what we had before we had a fiat currency in the United States, right? It used to be that every dollar was backed up in gold, and it made it much more difficult to regulate the currency because there was a physical amount of gold. You had to make sure that a dollar represented a specific amount of gold, and that gold was held in Fort Knox, and a dollar was worth a specific amount of gold. And you'll remember that at one point, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was demanding to be paid in gold. And a lot of the Middle Eastern oil countries were demanding to be paid in gold because they didn't trust paper money, right? And that was going on. And that was a way to make sure that their oil maintained value even if the U.S. currency were to crash. And the gold standard is kind of a fixation of that Ron Paul libertarian element, right? Somehow, they can't explain the mathematics of it, but somehow everything would be better if we were on the gold standard. They can't explain it. And right now, gold is selling like crazy, right? Because the economy is doing badly, oil prices have dropped, mass unemployment, people are buying up gold. And the rich are getting gold bars are selling like crazy. And so that demand for gold is causing the value of gold to increase because there's more demand for it. It's pretty wild how these things work. The gold standard has been a long obsession of the far right. You can go back to the 1920s, and way before the 1920s. You can go back to the 1800s, right? We had a gold standard, and the populists, who were they weren't socialists, but they were kind of progressives, small farmers, progressives. They demanded a silver standard, because they thought there's more silver than there is gold, so that'll make it easier. That'll make the dollar, more flexible, right? We can change the value of a dollar more flexibly. We can more carefully regulate our currency. So there was, the free silver movement. That was the big movement among the populists, free silver. And William Jennings Bryan, who was the first, he was a populist who joined the Democrats. He brought the populist movement into the Democratic Party, right? The populist movement had started out, it was Republicans, Abraham Lincoln, the Republicans, they were the party of free soil, free labor, free men, or what was it? Free land, free labor, free men. They were an anti-slavery party. They were supported by labor unions, small farmers. And the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln he was in Illinois, which was an unsettled state at that point. So he was considered to be a wild man, from the country. And, old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. Abraham Lincoln had this kind of populist image. He was this very, very tall lawyer from Illinois who was going to fight for the working man and stand up to the slaveholders. People all throughout the United States were sick of the slaveholders and how much influence they had in Washington. They could destroy any law. They were basically demanding that the rest of the country comply with the Fugitive Slave Act. And so Abraham Lincoln said he didn't want to abolish slavery, but he was going to go to Washington and make sure the slave states stopped kicking around the rest of the country. He was going to stand up to the slave plantation owners. And that was, the Republican Party. And it was kind of a populist appeal, anti-slavery, populist. Old Abe Lincoln came up from the wilderness. It was the song Lincoln and Liberty Too. Right? And Lincoln was kind of a progressive, right? Very progressive figure. After the Civil War, after Lincoln's death, the Republican Party became more and more the party of industrialists, of industrial capitalists in the North, right? And they gradually, the small farmers, the labor unions were being pushed out of it. So you saw the rise of the populist movement, which was the elements of the Republican Party that were angry that the Republican Party had been taken away from them. They were small farmers. They wanted to nationalize the railroads. They wanted to nationalize the railroads. They wanted fair distribution of land because a lot of the land was being bought up by big companies, and they wanted the land to be more fairly distributed and more transparency in the buying of land. They talked about they didn't talk about capitalism, but they talked about monopolies. They didn't like the monopolies, and they talked about the producers versus the consumers. There was a consumer class, and there was everyone who produces. They were very religious. They often framed their arguments in terms of Protestant religion, but it was a progressive movement that emerged. And originally it was anti-racist. It saw racism as a tool of the capitalists to hurt the workers, it was pro-black and it was anti-slavery. So you had the populist movement, and the demand for a silver standard rather than a gold standard was a big part of what they were about. They thought that would fix the economy. Well, gradually, racism started to work its way into the populist movement, right? The populists, they started accusing the Republican Party of giving government jobs to black people. That was one of their grievances. And as the populist movement became more and more racist, you had the rise of William Jennings Bryan, who was this very large man who was a very, very good orator and was a fundamentalist Christian. And he kind of became the face of the populist movement. And he took the populist movement into the Democratic Party. The Democrats were at that point the party of the Jim Crow South. And he's the man who brought the populist movement into the Democratic Party and made it fully racist, William Jennings Bryan. And, Saddam Hussein. Yes, I will. Saddam Hussein. CIA, Iran. I will definitely talk about that, Ali. Thank you very much. And yes, the Republican Party, they went from the Republicans, they had their Independent People's Party, and then they became racist Democrats. And that was the populist movement, and part of it was free silver. And actually, little known fact, I'm spending a lot of time on this, but it's an important question. Little known fact is that the author of Wizard of Oz, the book The Wizard of Oz, was a populist. And The Wizard of Oz was a satirical novel intended to mock William McKinley. William McKinley ran against William Jennings Bryan in the election, and William McKinley was seen as, he was just seen as a huckster, as a con man, like the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. And at the end of the Wizard of Oz, you've all seen the movie, it's her ruby red slippers that take her home, right? She clicks her slippers and says, there's no place like home, and she goes home to Kansas, to the good old days of farming, right? Well, in the book, it's silver slippers, right? And they take her back to the good old days of farming, right? And the story is, everyone was happy in Kansas, being good, prosperous farmers. And then a big tornado called a capitalist crisis came along, and everyone's lost, and they're on this yellow brick road, which is the gold standard, which is leading them nowhere. And the man at the end of the yellow brick road, the Wizard of Oz, is just a big con man, and the real answer is silver, right? And it's the silver standard. It was a political allegory, and it was such a good story, it just kind of caught on. That's where the Wizard of Oz comes from. Kind of amusing. It started out as a political allegory. What I think is even more amusing, right? So in the original Wizard of Oz, right, it's the silver standard is the answer. But the movie of the Wizard of Oz, they're ruby red slippers that get her home. And when was the Wizard of Oz made? 1930s. So those ruby red slippers, maybe the answer was communism, right? I mean, it's 1930s, Hollywood, just saying. But yeah, originally, The Wizard of Oz was a popular populist allegory story. So yeah, that they called it funny money. Funny money was what they called it. That was a term, that people used to talk about, the silver standard folks, and then in the 1930s there was a big push to go back to the gold standard, a rant against the Federal Reserve, Father Coughlin, and that's always been an obsession. Glenn Beck was selling money, was selling gold coins at one point, and a lot of conservatives who were big fans of Glenn Beck got ripped off by gold selling companies. The John Birch Society, it's an obsession of the far right. I mean, the Alex Jones crowd, the far right element has always been obsessed with gold. It is an obsession, right? And people read into it, they're like, well, it's that people read into it that it's the old critique of usury, and it's like kind of the right-wing anti-capitalism critique of usury, but it's just a weird thing, and it results in gold having a lot of value. Right now, the price of gold is going through the roof because there's high demand for it, because people think it has value. People think it has value, so they want it, and then it has value because people want it. That's how economics works. It's very, very strange. Alrighty, the Venus Project. The Venus Project. Folks, I remember when, what was the movie? What was that movie that was promoting the Venus Project? It was a big movie. What was it? I can't remember the name of it. It was really popular. Everyone at my college watched it. And I went to a conservative little town college, Zeitgeist, right? Zeitgeist. Have you seen American Factory? Writing this down. American Factory. All right. Zeitgeist was very popular. And it was like in three parts. The first was like, a critique of religion. The second was a critique of 9/11, and the third was a critique of the Federal Reserve System. And I watched it very closely. I watched the sequel where they interviewed, there were some follow-ups, and it put forward the Venus Project, which was this push for technology. And actually, I was a little bit too hostile to it at the time. I overall, I would agree with the main message, which is that, capitalism and the rule of profits is a problem, and technology can point to the way out. What I didn't agree with was the complete rejection of Marxism. I mean, they have a screen where they insist that because socialist countries have money, they don't matter, right? That capitalism, communism, and fascism are all the same. That's ridiculous. But because they have currency in socialist countries, they don't matter. There was kind of this dismissal of Marxism, and like an unwillingness to acknowledge that their plan for what they called a resource-based economy, their vision of a stateless, classless world based on material abundance, that's Marxism. But at the same time, I mean, it was in a way progressive that millions of people were talking about developing technology to create a world of abundance. It was progressive in its own way. I was a little bit too hostile to it at the time. I'm more friendly to that. I actually know some people who worked on it. I don't want to say names, but I actually know some of the people that made that movie. And it's weird. I mean, at the time, I remember years ago, whatever, but I actually know some of the people who worked on it, and overall, I have a more positive opinion of it than I used to. I don't agree with all the conspiracy content. At one point, it claims like the Vietnam War was staged, the Vietnamese were being funded by the U.S. government or something. I don't agree with that. There's a lot in it that I don't agree with, but there you go. But yeah, I mean, the Venus Project, it was a sign amid the financial crisis that many people, were unsatisfied with capitalism. We're looking for alternatives. That's what it was. And it pointed toward technology advancing. It didn't reject the notion of historical progress. Overall, it was a progressive thing. There were things about it I didn't like, but the overall narrative, the problem being greedy capitalists who rule the world, and the solution being advancing technology, you know, throw socialism and Marxism into that. I'm with you. Okay, all right. How I was asked about countries like Australia and breaking up U.S. hegemony. Wow. Well, I think the main thing is just simply making the case to people in your country that China is not their enemy, that Russia is not their enemy, that Venezuela is not their enemy, and that what do they really have to gain by going along with Wall Street and the Pentagon's crusade against socialist countries? I think that's really the question. If you're living in a minor imperialist country that's not the United States or Britain, and you know, I think you have a duty to make clear to your population that why should you go along with Wall Street and London's crusade against Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba and Venezuela and North Korea? What is in it for your people to gain from that? I think that's a fair point, and especially with a financial crisis that we're in with unemployment surging, wouldn't it be in the interest of people in Australia or people in Norway or people in Sweden or France or Germany to do business with Russia, to do business with China? Wouldn't it be in their interest? You know, the Germans have gotten screwed by this anti-Russia stuff, right? Germany is right next to Russia. They do business with Russia. Russia trades with them, right? And they have been forced. They're a NATO country. There's NATO troops there. There's foreign troops in Germany. They're occupied. And their economy, I mean, they have a lot of corporations there, but their economy is kind of tied down and tied in with Western capitalism. And they have been forced to economically hurt themselves by going against Russia. Why? I mean, that's a fair question. What do French people have to gain by going against Russia, right? I mean, that's the question. You don't even have to frame it in terms of international solidarity or class struggle or Marxism. Just frame it simply as okay, Wall Street and London, they're out to get Russia and China. But what do you, as a country within the European Union, what do your people have to gain from this? You know, I mean, that's just a fair question. What is in it for you, right? I mean, are the interests of the United States and Britain really the interests of your country? That's a fair question. And that could be a question that could get you that far. You know, there's no need. Yes, I would like people to study Marxism. I'd like people to understand the whole picture. But why not? Why not just you know, just go ahead and ask simple questions like that, right? I heard a story one time of a communist in the United States who was on trial in New York City in the 1920s for blasphemy. In New York City during the 1920s, it was a crime to deny the existence of God in public. They called it blasphemy. And this man, this communist, was accused of having denied the existence of God in public. So he was on trial. And at the time, the Communist Party of the United States had changed its name. It was called the Workers' Party of the United States, right? They were going by the name the Workers' Party, right? They had started out as the Communist Party, Communist Labor Party. In the 1920s, they were the Workers' Party of America. Later, they were the Communist Party again. But in the 1920s, they were the Workers' Party of America. And so this man, this communist, is on trial in New York City for the crime of blasphemy, which is like a low-level local crime. And, you know, it's offensive to religious people to deny the existence of God in public. He says he didn't do it, but they got him. And so the prosecutor is on the witness stand. The prosecutor says to him, so, you know, Mr. So-and-so, I understand that you're a member of the Communist Party. And he says, no, I'm not. He says, but you're a member of the Communist Party, aren't you? He says, no, I'm not a member of the Communist Party. Nope. He says, but how can you not? I mean, everyone knows you're a member of the Communist Party. He says, no, I don't know of any organization at this time called the Communist Party. Because it was called the Workers' Party. And the prosecutor just had like a meltdown. But everyone knows you're a member of the No. I don't know of any organization by that name. Right? Now, you would think he would say, yes, I am a member of the Communist Party. I'm proud of. Why give your enemy a weapon they don't need? He was trying to demonize him to the jury by saying he's a member of the Communist Party. And at that time, the Communist Party was called the Workers' Party. So he just said, nope, not part of the Communist Party. Don't know any group that exists currently under that name. And there you go. He was acquitted. right? Another story I heard, right, is, they asked a room full of communists. They said, imagine that you've been arrested. You've been arrested for blowing up a building, right? You've been arrested. You've been charged with the crime of blowing up a building. What would you say in your defense? And they go around, and the person says, well, it's the capitalists. They bomb countries. They kill people. They're the ones who should be arrested. The next person, okay. He said, well, it's the bosses. They destroy the lives of working people. They're the ones that should be arrested. Okay. What would you say? And everyone comes up with some very, very spirited defense. And he says, yes, the old man says. He says, but you missed the most important thing, which is you didn't do it. Right? You didn't do it. You didn't do it, right? You're innocent, right? That people miss that you never should give your political opponent anything they don't already have, right? If you're playing basketball or soccer, you never let your opponent score a goal that they're not going to score anyway. You try to, so why give your political enemy something you didn't have? You didn't blow up that building. So there's no need to make the what about argument. There's no need. You didn't blow it up, right? He was not a member of the Communist Party. He was part of the Workers' Party. Don't give it to your enemy. Another great example of this. After the fall of the Soviet Union, you will know that they had elections in Soviet Russia and former Soviet Union, Russia. They had elections, and the communists won a sweeping, a lot of votes, and there was the Black October. Yeltsin ended up having to dissolve the parliament. And all of this, but what was the slogan that the communists ran on right after the fall of the Soviet Union? What was their slogan? You would think it would be capitalism is destroying things, bring back communism. Nope. Their slogan was, we need leaders with experience. Think about it. We need leaders with experience. In Russia, in 1992, who were the only people that had any experience in running the government? Communists. And who could disagree with that? We need leaders with experience. Again, never give your political opponent anything they don't already have, right? You don't have to argue with them about the fall of the Soviet Union. And they convinced millions of people voted for the Communist Party on the basis of, we need leaders with experience. Capitalism was coming in, all kinds of problems. We need leaders with experience. Brilliant slogan, right? You never want to give your enemy anything they don't already have. So, there you go. I don't know. That was about Australia. All right. Okay. All right. So yes, if you can convince people in your country that it's not in their economic benefit to go along with the United States, you don't have to, I'm all for people being won to socialism and such, but why make that the dividing line? Sometimes you can make bigger dividing lines. I guess that's the point I was trying to make in my little anecdotes here. All right. The role of struggling for socialism in the United States. Well, I have been outspoken on this point, and about it. If it's a good point, you must say it again. I have been repeatedly saying that socialists in the United States need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. Get out of the movement and get to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Out of the movement to the masses. Folks, socialism in the United States. When I was growing up, I had never met another socialist in the United States. I didn't even realize that anyone in the United States believed in socialism, right? And when I found out there was a communist party because of the internet, I was blown away. And then I found out there were many communist parties, and I thought it was amazing. All of those communist groups exist in complete isolation from the broad masses of the American people. Most people have never met anybody who is in any of those groups. Ever. Right? Those groups exist in this little tiny enclave separated from U.S. society called the movement. And it's a protest cage. When there's a peace rally, all of them are there selling their newspaper, and they all hate each other, and they all shit talk each other. And they all, you're a big phony. My group is better than your group. Your group is somehow racist. Your group is somehow transphobic. Your group is somehow pro-imperialist. Your group wasn't as anti-imperialist as mine. What national parks? Okay. it's constant, right? Constant. It is a big, big thing. And it's like among these groups that are competing with each other, the goal isn't even to try and be the most effective in reaching the masses. The goal is to impress the other people in the protest cage, right? The idea is to convince the other people in the protest cage that you're the most revolutionary and they're not. And it's a big waste of time. It is a big waste of time. Meanwhile, outside of the protest cage, people are more open to socialism than ever before. People are open to these ideas. I mean, look how many people look at my videos. I'm a guy on YouTube. Look how many people watch these videos. You know, people are more open to socialism. In New York City, when I was growing up in Ohio, when I lived in Cleveland, when I was in a small town, when I was a kid, when I was living in different parts of the country, I would always get knocks on my doors. Hi, would you like a copy of the Watchtower? You know, Jehovah's Witnesses. Knock, knock, knock. Hi, I'm from the Church of Latter-day Saints. Would you like a copy of the Book of Mormon? But never have I ever gotten a knock on my door and someone said, hi, I'm a socialist. I'm here to tell you all about how you can be free from capitalism. Never have I gotten a knock on my door like that. Never. And that's what needs to start happening. We need to get out of the protest cage, out of the movement, and get to the masses. The masses are open to hearing about socialism, and the movement is a dead end. And we're at the point where the movement is more problematic than the masses, right? The movement, people who go to liberal rallies, people who go to rallies around Black Lives Matter or impeach Trump or whatever, those folks tend to be more pro-war than average Americans are. Average Americans, they're just, polls show the overwhelming majority of Americans, Black, white, Latino, Middle Eastern, Asian, they're men, women, they're opposed to these wars. They don't want us involved in the Middle East. Meanwhile, people in the protest cage have been watching Rachel Maddow, and they know that if you're against the war, you're repeating conspiracy theories. And you must be, believing conspiracy theories. And we need to drive out Trump because he's a friend of Putin, and he's negotiating with that evil dictator, Kim Jong-un. The movement that communists spend their time trying to recruit is worse than the masses. I'm telling you this. You go to any community, any working class neighborhood in the United States, any demographic, even neighborhoods where a lot of people are in the military, doesn't matter. People are against these wars. People are anti-imperialist. People feel like the government works for a group of rich people and not them. People feel like the system is rigged. People feel like there's a group of rich people who have all the power and we're getting screwed. People have in their gut more class consciousness than they have ever had in my lifetime. That's the masses. However, the people in the protest cage are more brainwashed than I've ever seen them. If you went into a protest cage during the Vietnam War, you went into a protest cage during the Iraq War, when I was coming around. Everyone there, the government is lying, they were open. Now you go into a protest cage, you hear, we need to drive out Trump because he's not starting a war, and we have a democratic system, we just need to get money out of politics, we have a constitution. And you say, well, haven't rich people always run the USA? What, is that a conspiracy theory? You should be outlawed. You should be banned from YouTube. The movement, what people call the movement, is more reactionary, more in defense of the status quo in the United States, and more pro-war than average people are. So why the hell are communists focused on trying to recruit a movement that doesn't want them and ignoring the broad masses of people? Right? I kid you not. 2016 election, right? I was not in the socialist group I was in. I was still talking to people, but they were not being very nice to me and whatever. I was reporting. I went to a lot of Bernie Sanders events. I went to a lot of Bernie Sanders events. I went to a lot of Trump events to cover it as a reporter. And I'll tell you, I went to the big Bernie Sanders march in New York City. I went to a big Bernie Sanders rally in D.C. I went to a big Bernie Sanders rally in Vermont. I saw two communists at the New York City one, which, keep in mind, there's more communists in New York City than any other part of the country. I saw two communists at the New York City one. Socialist Alternative had a literature table, and the Spartacist League was selling their newspaper. But Maoists, Trotskyists, they weren't there. They weren't. All these people, thousands of people were in the streets marching for Bernie in 2016, and the communists had no interest in talking to them. No interest in trying to recruit. No. Meanwhile, I went to a lot of Trump rallies, interviewed people. I saw communists at the Trump rallies, but they were not talking to the Trump supporters. They were not trying to say, hey, Trump's not really the champion of the working man, but you should learn about socialism. Oh, no, no. The communists were there. They were across the street, giving the middle finger, screaming, yelling, cursing, threatening violence. It was a mess. The masses are more open to what we're about than ever before. But the communists have made this decision. We can only recruit out of the movement. No, you got to get to the masses. The masses, and go where the masses are. Go where the masses are, recruit the masses, right? The idea is to get out of the movement and get to the masses. And that, in order to do that, we need an ideological shift. We need to fight back against synthetic leftism. We need to fight back against the synthetic left. We need to fight back against it. Synthetic left ideology, this notion that socialism is a struggle against alienation. It is a struggle of the intellectuals for freedom, that it's not about working people. This notion that populism is bad, that needs to be combated against. We have to get back to William Z. Foster and Eugene Debs and Gus Hall and Huey Newton and Paul Robeson, okay? We need to get back to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Anna Louise Strong. We need to get back to real leftism, right? I'm writing this book on the synthetic left. There's an ideological problem here. There is a big ideological problem here. And we have to get back to left-wing populism. More than ever, we have to get back to it. We got to get out of the notion that this is a middle-class hippie struggle for freedom. It's not. It's working people fighting for their lives and for their communities. Must be said. So that's why I formed the Center for Political Innovation. We're going to have our launch conference whenever restrictions are lifted and we can start building it again. It was supposed to be April 18th. But we're going to have we're going to ideologically change. We're going to reorient. And we're going to get to the masses. We're going to get to the masses. And ultimately, we need to be feeding people. We need to be caring for people. When I was in Cleveland, Ohio, I remember there was an organization in Cleveland, Ohio at that time. I don't know if it still exists. I don't keep up with Cleveland these days. But it was a black nationalist organization. It was called Black on Black Crime Incorporated. And it was headed by a barbershop owner named Art McCoy. And it was on the east side of Cleveland. Every Wednesday night, they had their meeting. There'd be 80, 90 people there. And anything that went on in the neighborhood, they were all over it. Whether it was, traffic, they felt like the speed light cameras were not good. Whether it was police brutality, whether it was hospitals closing. Everyone knew that they were like the center of the black community. They were the organization that got things done. They were not Marxists, not leftists. They were black nationalists. The RCP would always come and sell their stuff at their meetings. A few Workers' World members would show up. There'd be white people there too, but overwhelmingly it was a black nationalist organization in a black neighborhood. And they were the center of the community. And when people were going to get evicted from their apartment, they would go there and maybe they could get help. And it was a community organization. And Art McCoy and Black on Black Crime Incorporated, that was what the Communist Party USA was during its better years. In Brooklyn, in Harlem, that's what the Communist Party USA was. And that's what the Black Panthers were in the 1970s. In Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in Oakland, they were the same way, right? They were centers of the community, right? The Communist Party had their unemployment councils. They fed people. They took care of people. I mean, that is the goal. The center of the community. Get to the masses. Get out of the movement. The movement is a waste of your time. I'm telling you, there is this enclave isolated from U.S. society of groups yelling at each other. My group is better than your group, and you're a phony, no, you're a phony, and trying to control the liberal protest cage. That's a dead end. The answer is to get to the masses, and that requires an ideological shift. We have to push back against the synthetic left and anti-populism, number one. Number two, right? We need to get to ordinary people. We need to do outreach. We need to engage the masses of people, not be in the echo chamber. So I hope that answers your question. I'm taking a long time to answer these questions tonight. All right, capitalism in the third world. It's an important question. How does capitalism exploit the third world? Because there's a lot of confusion about it. If you go to the university campuses, you learn that imperialism is cultural, right? Imperialism is the fact that people watch American movies all over the world. Imperialism is the fact that that Christianity is everywhere, but indigenous religions have faded away. That's not the essence of what imperialism is. Imperialism is a situation where Wall Street and London corporations stay rich by keeping the world poor. Great example. Great example is the American Revolution. Not that America is exploited by other countries, but I'm explaining this. Do you remember the Boston Tea Party? You remember the Boston Tea Parties? Well, what was going on at the Boston Tea Party? 13 colonies. They were colonized by the British. They were British colonies. And they were required to buy their tea from the East India Company, from a British corporation. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to import tea from other capitalists. They wanted to have a domestic economy. But the British, in order to keep the 13 colonies as their property, were made laws requiring the 13 colonies to buy their products from a British company. That was the regulation. So the colonists wanted to raise their own economy. They wanted to make profits. They wanted to develop their own industries. So they dumped the tea into the harbors, right? It was about asserting your right to economic independence. We're going to produce our own products. We're going to have our own corporations. You're not going to keep us as a captive market, right? Well, what was done at the Boston Tea Party is basically what the British did to India, the East India Company. They went to India. India had a vast textile industry, and so did Bangladesh. You read about Sonar Bengal, right? The golden Bangladesh, right? You know, for thousands of years, people in India have been weaving and making beautiful cloth and textile and products. The British went there. They burned down all the looms. And they said, you're required, at the point of a gun, to import all your cloth from Britain. They destroyed their industries. And instead of them, people in India, getting wealthy by making their own products and selling them and becoming products, they became a captive market. They were underdeveloped. They were forcibly underdeveloped by the British Empire. China, another great example, right? China, thousands of years, it's had industries, first country with paper money, first country with gunpowder, etc., right? So China, at the point of a gun, is forced by the British Empire, not once, but twice, in opium wars, to let the British come in and put out all of their companies out of business and force all the Chinese companies out of business, force China to start buying food, buying products, buying clothing, buying all kinds of things from the British, making the British corporations rich by keeping China poor, making it a client state. Instead of being a state that produces, that has its own industries, it's a client state. It's a state that is a captive market that purchases. That's the nature of imperialism. It holds back economic development. That's what imperialism is. That is what imperialism is. It's holding back economic development. And that is the nature of imperialism. Why is the Middle East the way it is? Look at the Middle East. Because all it has is oil, right? The Ba'ath Arab socialists, the Soviet Union wanted to work with them to try and develop the Middle East, to try and build infrastructure, to try and bring irrigation in there. Gaddafi, what did Gaddafi do? He built irrigation. He was trying to get them out there. But the Middle East remains impoverished. Why? Because all they have is oil. Right? The imperialists have kept them as oil and sand, right? You look at countries like Iran. Iran is very developed. Iran has its own steel industries. It has all kinds of economic development has happened in Iran. They have their own airplane manufacturing. They've got their own car industries, and that's the fruits of an independent economy. They broke out of Western capitalism, and because of that, they are able to develop independently. They don't import all their cars from the United States. They make their own cars, right? They make their own steel. They make their own phones. That is breaking out of imperialism, right? Imperialism is about keeping the world poor so that Wall Street and London can stay rich. It's about forcing countries to not make their own products, not economically develop, but just be captive markets, client states. And in a lot of cases, that means keeping semi-feudal relations intact, keeping feudalism basically set up in the countryside. So that's what capitalist exploitation of the third world is. What do you know about the Lebanese Civil War? Okay. Okay. Alrighty. Okay, so then I was asked about, that's a nice transition, into Saddam Hussein, CIA, Iran. Well, yeah, I mean, Saddam Hussein, he worked with the United States to attack the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iraq-Iran war was a horrendous disaster. At least 1 million people died. It was horrendous. Chemical weapons were used. It was horrendous. And I've been to Iran and I've met people in Iran who have suffered, from the chemical attacks that took place during that war. And, the United States condemned Saddam Hussein, denounced Saddam Hussein, but they were happy with him because he was fighting Iran. The Iraq-Iran war was a disaster, and it was very much the imperialists trying to please each other. You had Ba'athist Arab socialism. It was a secular movement that was based on Arab nationalism and socialism, right? It was the Arab peoples, fighting for their nation. It was like Marxism applied to Arab conditions. You read Michel Aflaq. And then you had in Iran, you had the Islamic Revolution, which was Shiite Islam. It was not nationalist, right? The Shah had been a Persian nationalist. He'd said Persians were the superior race, that Kurds, that Arabs, that Turkmen, that they were inferior, right? Well, the Islamic Revolution of Iran said that racism could never be tolerated, that all people were equal. It was an Islamic revolution of Shia Muslims to try and create, not capitalism, but Islam. It was a revolutionary anti-capitalist current, very, very opposed to Ba'athist Arab socialism, right? Ba'athist Arab socialism is for the Arab people. It's not religious. Shia Islam, very, very religious, and not for Arabs. It's for all nationalities. So two revolutionary currents in the Middle East that are opposed to each other. And, all right, Progressive International. Two revolutionary currents in the Middle East that are opposed to each other. And it's very clear that Western capitalist powers did everything they could, and so did Israel, to try and get the two groupings to fight each other like crazy. And millions of people died. Millions of people died. And it was horrendous. And at the time, U.S. media covered it up, almost like it wasn't even happening. It's kind of like the war in Yemen. There's a war going on. 24 hours a day, there's war going on in Yemen. You turn on CNN, you would never notice it. Same thing with the Iraq-Iran war. It's like it's not happening, right? It was like it never happened. It was a war going on, and the USA, at one point, it was supporting Saddam Hussein throughout most of it. Later, we find out about Iran-Contra, and the United States was supporting Iran. So the idea was to play these two revolutionary currents against each other. All kinds of people died. It was horrendous. And the intent was to weaken both of them. And it worked, right? I mean, millions of Iranians died, millions of Iraqis died. Iraq eventually got so weak, you had the Gulf War and the sanctions, that eventually Iraq was invaded. Iraq has been just completely destroyed as a nation, subject to so much national humiliation. Even the museums in Iraq, where you have these ancient pottery, Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, all have been destroyed. Iraq has been subject to so much national humiliation. Iran, similar story, right? Now the Islamic Republic solidified itself during the Iraq-Iran war, right? During the Iraq-Iran war, you had the Basij councils that were essential in defending the Iranian, revolution. You had the rise of, what they called the construction jihad, which was like mobilizing the country to build highways and hospitals and schools and a lot of construction going on, and Iranians being mobilized, and Khomeini kind of, controlling the economy and moving in a more socialistic direction to fight the Iraqi invaders. It's complicated. These things are very, very complicated. We know that Iran took more of a right-wing turn in the late 80s, but it's very, very complicated. These things are very, very complicated. It's not so simple. But yes, that was what happened. And yes, Saddam Hussein worked with the United States. He carried out the Iraq-Iran war. He's responsible for lots of deaths, and there's no one can deny that. No one can deny that. That doesn't mean his economic policies weren't beneficial to Iraq prior to that. But I mean, we can recognize that. But Iran did things during the Iraq-Iran war that were not good as well, right? And that you have to look at these things. You don't want to be like, it's not like baseball. These are human lives. This is human lives, not baseball. It's not football. You don't want to sit in front of your TV and be like, ooh, I'm on Iran's side, go Iran, or ooh, I'm on Iraq's side, go Iraq. This is human life. This is reality. Not a football game, not a baseball game. And you look at these countries like China, like Iran, like Venezuela, that are trying to survive, that are facing far more hostile circumstances than those of us who are Western leftists can ever imagine, fighting for their revolution. We don't understand it. We don't understand it. And they have to make compromises. They have to make sacrifices. They have to make strategic alliances. And they do things that they are in situations that we don't even want to imagine. Right? I've used the example before of how the Bolsheviks implemented the death penalty for drinking alcohol a week after the revolution, right? Because people were drinking and partying to celebrate the revolution, and the White Army was coming, and so they conscripted all the men, and they said, if we catch you with alcohol, we execute you. And they had to have enforced it at least a couple times. Can you imagine shooting somebody for drinking alcohol? I can't imagine that. I can't imagine that. But it's a kill or be killed situation. These people are fighting for their lives. The level of economic development is so low. People are in such dire poverty. It's a kill or be killed situation. They're fighting for control of their country so they can organize the economy and feed the people. Right? And it's not a situation that any of us who are Western leftists can even comprehend. Violent revolutions are not good, pleasant things, folks. They're not romantic. They're not Hollywood movies. They're ugly. Lots of people die. Lots of people get hurt. Lots of lives are destroyed. People have PTSD for the rest of their lives. Revolutions, when they become violent revolutions, are very, very horrific. I think about Kent State University, May 4th, 1970. Four students were killed. Horrendous event. 4 students were killed. And people, I used to, when I was in Ohio, I would go to the commemorations they would have every year. And there were crowds full of people with PTSD who were having episodes, who were traumatized by seeing 4 people gunned down. Well, in Iran, during the Iranian Revolution, they saw thousands of people gunned down. People used to go to the protests in burial garb. People would go to the protests against the Shah in the clothes they wanted to be buried in to save their families money and the trouble. They would go in a burial shroud, understanding that they would be killed. Right? I mean, that's what people were facing. We don't understand this. And for us to judge it and to just be like, oh, they're not pure and they're revolutionary. I read a book and I understand it. It's arrogance. We don't understand this stuff, okay? We can recognize that capitalism is their enemy. We can recognize that these countries are fighting for their lives, but we don't understand it, right? We just have to recognize that imperialism is the enemy. These folks are resisting imperialism, and they're trying their hardest under horrific circumstances to raise themselves up out of poverty. That's what's going on there, and we need to just kind of understand that. And it's not going to be ideologically pure, and it's not going to be, the human rights paradise we would all like to see, because that's not the world we live in. That's not the world these folks live in. And I hope what I'm saying can speak to some people. Anti-tankyism is really big, right? Technology, solar power, Middle East. Okay, all right. Middle East. Wars. Folks don't get it. I guess that's what I just needed to say. And that it's not helpful for Western leftists to just pile condemnation or judgment onto these countries. We need to recognize their achievements. There's no need to gloss over the hardships of countries that are building socialism. There's no need to gloss over the mistakes or the bad things that they've done or the alliances they've made. The important thing is to just recognize what's going on and expose that imperialism and the global order where Wall Street and London stay rich by keeping the world poor is the main enemy. And that we as Westerners, we are also hurt by this system. It hurts us, right? It's driving our living standards down. The whole world has an interest in getting rid of capitalism. That's what needs to be said. Okay, American Factory. It's a documentary on Netflix. It's about a Chinese factory that's in the United States. It's owned by a Chinese company. There's a union drive there. It's very good from what I've heard. Many people have said to me, I need to see this movie. I haven't had a time to just sit down and watch it. I don't watch TV as much as the missus. My wife loves to watch TV. I don't. I get antsy. I'm sitting there and the missus likes to watch TV and I don't. She likes to watch different things than I do. So one of these days I'm going to sit down and watch American Factory. I need to see it. You're not the first person who's told me about it, and I need to watch it, but I just haven't gotten around to it. It's kind of, we're stuck at home. It's a negotiation. My wife probably won't like American Factory. She'll be bored. I'm bored with the things that she watches. So, it's this kind of back and forth. So I need to figure this out. But, we were watching that Mrs. Maisel series. That was one thing we could agree on. We can watch Big Bang Theory. We can watch Two and a Half Men. We can watch Modern Family. There's a couple things we can agree on because we kind of have to agree in order to watch the TV. So there you go. Alrighty. Sorry, I'll give you an answer after I watch American Factory. I've heard that in the movie the factory owner says some interesting things. That he makes some interesting comments. He seems to be familiar with Marxism, the factory owner or something. And that it's more interesting that Obama pushed the movie. Apparently, is what I've heard. But regardless, I've heard interesting things about it. So now Kinky is asking me, what national parks have you visited? Well, for number one, I remember when I was a kid, a number of times I visited the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area. It was not a national park, but it was in Ohio near Cleveland. I visited there many times. I do remember when I was a kid, we also went to Rocky Mountain National Park, I believe. And we went there, and my family loved my mom and dad. I think they met when they were backpacking. And my dad, was involved in, all of that kind of thing. And, so yeah, they are all about camping and backpacking and hiking and nature and being out in the woods. And I was always attracted to cities. We went to the Grand Canyon. I went to the Grand Canyon National Park when I was a kid as well. But for me, it's always, I'm a city guy. That's where I'm at. I like being in nature. I don't, but there's some people who just really get a thrill out of it. They just get a thrill out of being in nature and all that. When I was a kid, I was always longing to get to a city. I was always longing cities were full of exciting things and creativity and different ideas and politics. And it seemed like, my family, their drive was to just get as far away from civilization as they could, get out into the woods. We lived in a small town, a small rural town that wasn't remote enough. We had to get, to a national park or someplace like that. Trying to think if I visited any other national parks. But yeah, definitely Grand Canyon, definitely Rocky Mountains. Trying to think if I visited any others. I don't know. Definitely went to the Cuyahoga National Recreation Area. Went there many times. But yeah, my personality. Kinky says she just visited the Grand Canyon 2 years ago, but city is too good until there's a garbage strike. Well, there you go. Exactly. And right now, I'm cooped up inside my one bedroom apartment here in Manhattan, or not Manhattan, Brooklyn. And part of me wants to take a little vacation if I could. Part of me is looking at, financially working out if I could take a little vacation. I want to go back to California, folks. The first time I ever went to California was when I was 19 years old, and I was sent there by the political group I was in to help build a Stop War Against Iran demonstration. And so for 2 weeks, I slept on the couch of some political organizers there, and I went all over the city putting up posters for a No War Against Iran demonstration. This was 2008, the summer that Obama was running for president. Putting up posters all over the city. We had our Stop War Against Iran demonstration, and a bunch of Shah supporters came, and there was like a scuffle. But it was a good rally, and I spent 2 weeks in Los Angeles. That was the first time I'd ever been to California. After that, I hadn't been to California for like a decade. Now I've been back there, to do reporting. I went there to Oakland to cover the protests. I went there to Berkeley to cover the Milo Yiannopoulos, the free speech and right wing and all of that. I've been to Los Angeles. I had an event in Los Angeles last fall. And I want to get out to California. California has a special vibe to it. When I was in California, I interviewed some California separatists, some people that want California to become its own country. And they talked about California just has something special about it, and some of that is synthetic left, hippie kind of stuff, but not all of it. I think there's some truth in that, honestly. I want to get out to California. I know there's a lot of viewers out there in California. I want to do another LA event. The plan is to kick off the Center for Political Innovation, not just in New York on the East Coast, but also, to have a West Coast launch conference. I'm for that. I want to get out there. There's something peaceful about it. I got good friends out in LA. I don't know if he's watching. Ramiro, longtime friend of mine out in LA. But there's great folks in LA. I know there's, Justin is out in LA, and, Space Communist is out there, and I'm going to forget people. I don't want to forget people. But there's just all kinds of people out in LA that are great. And I want to get to LA. I want to get back to San Francisco, Bay Area. I mean, it's just, there's something. California is a special place. I probably wouldn't like Northern California as much. Maybe I would, though. Maybe in Northern California, maybe I would like it. I just haven't been there, right? Never been to Sacramento. I don't know. Sacramento, even Northern, I just don't know it. But maybe it's good. I don't know. But yeah, I need to get out to California more. So there you go. I hope that answers your question, Kinky. What do you know about the Lebanese Civil War? We know about, I don't want to give you an answer that's completely ignorant. We know about Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And I think that's where Hezbollah got started, if I'm not mistaken, was that it was various resistance groups to the Israeli invasion. I also know that in the 80s, that was kind of a turning point. Jane Fonda, right, had been, I don't know if folks know Jane Fonda, right, kind of old, but, I grew up in Ohio hearing stories about there is this Hollywood actress named Jane Fonda, and she disrespected America by opposing the Vietnam War. But there was this actress named Jane Fonda, Hollywood actress. She was in a lot of movies in the 60s, and she was against the Vietnam War, and she went to North Vietnam, and she waved the Viet Cong flag, and she was kind of around the Revolutionary Union for a while, the RU, the Maoist group. She wasn't in it, but she would hang out with them, kind of. She was a leftist, and she was very into encouraging dissent among American GIs and soldiers. She did a whole tour where she would go near U.S. military bases and do these performances called FTA, which stood for F the Army. And she did all these performances to try and encourage GIs to not fight in the Vietnam War. She was a very, very strong opponent of the Vietnam War in the 70s, and she was pretty pro-communist. Actually, she made a communist movie with the French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, a movie called, it's called Tout va bien, where everything's all right. That was where she was at. She was a communist. She was a leftist. Well, in the early 80s, when the Lebanese Civil War was going on, she was not anymore. She was married to Ted Turner, and she went around with a lot of people that are now in DSA, were supporting her, urging leftists to support Israel. And she and her husband, Ted Turner, Tom Hayden, not Ted Turner, Tom Hayden. She and her husband, Tom Hayden, who had been a big 60s radical, founder of DSA, SDS. She and Tom Hayden went around telling leftists, people who had marched against the Vietnam War, now is the time to support Israel. And that was kind of her turning point. And that was the thing. There were a lot of people who marched against the Vietnam War, that when stuff started in Lebanon and when Israel-Palestine stuff really got going in the 80s, they were out of there, right? They were pro-Israel, right? And that was true. I mean, a lot of the Americans who marched against the Vietnam War were Jewish Americans, right? They were leftist Jewish Americans, and they supported Israel, right? They were for Israel. They were against the Vietnam War. They maybe even had a Marxist approach, but they were for Israel. Being against Israel was anti-Semitic as far as they were concerned. And that was Jane Fonda. I mean, she was pro-Israel. Now, I know she's a feminist now, and she does like a feminist podcast or something, and she hangs out with Gloria Steinem, and, she's still a leftist kind of, like a liberal, feminist or whatever, but she's not a communist anymore. And, the fact that the Soviet Union was supporting the people of Lebanon and opposing Israel, the fact that, the Soviet Union was giving arms and weapons to the Palestinian organizations, that was when a lot of Jewish Americans, a lot of Jewish Americans who had been leftists and supporters of the protested the Vietnam War, maybe even been friendly to the Communist Party, they were out of there, right? They're out of there. And that's the thing, and that, I mean, for some people, that's an issue they can't get around. For other people, there's other issues they can't get around. But it became very clear that Israel was an ally of imperialism, and that anti-imperialist countries were opposing Israel, and that for a lot of Americans, that was too much. And they kind of hint at this in the movie Reds. I don't know if you've seen Reds with Warren Beatty. I was actually going to talk about Brazil, but I'm writing it down. Brazil. All right. Definitely going to talk about it. You see the movie Reds. The movie Reds, starring Warren Beatty, it's about two American communists, Louise Brandt and John Reed, and it's about their, it's kind of their adventure of being American communist journalists in the Russian Revolution. But it ends, it's softly anti-communist. The end of the movie, they have John Reed speaking to a crowd of people in Afghanistan, and it's like a crowd of people in turbans and they have swords, and they're translating his speech as he's giving his speech. He's giving his speech and they translate it, and then at some point in his speech, the crowd of guys in turbans all pull out their swords and start shouting Allah Akbar, and all this, and then he later says to the Soviet guy, "What did you translate? My speech? Why did they start yelling?" And they said, "Oh, we said, how did you call for holy war, a jihad against the West?" And he says, "But that you changed my words or something." And then the movie came out in 1980. The implication was supposed to be every work of art reflects the time period in which it is made, not the time period in which it takes place. And that was a subtle criticism of the left for supporting the Islamic Revolution of Iran and supporting the Palestinians, right? And it was supposed to, that was how a lot of leftists were feeling at the time, right? It was like, okay, it was one thing to support the Vietnamese, but these Arabs, these Muslims, these Iranians, these Ayatollahs, oh, they're barbaric, they're against Israel. And it was a subtle message to the left. You've hit rock bottom. You're supporting Muslims. You're supporting Al-Qaeda. Well, there was no Al-Qaeda back then, but you're supporting, Islamic anti-imperialists right now. You're supporting Ayatollahs. How dare you? Right? We know that's when that's when Christopher Hitchens, that's when he, started opposing Trotskyism, right? Christopher Hitchens was this British intellectual. I'm Christopher Hitchens, yes. And he was an atheist, and he was like a trot. But that's when he stopped supporting trots, because he didn't support the Iranian Revolution. And eventually, and what's weird is Christopher Hitchens, he was like a neocon. He was a big supporter of the Iraq War, an invasion of Iraq. He wrote this book called God is Not Great. It was like an atheist book, but it was very right-wing, very anti-Islamic. At the time of his death, Christopher Hitchens was still calling himself a Marxist. He maintained he was a Marxist. He was just really anti-Islamic and really pro-imperialist. He thought the West was pro-imperialist, and he claims he went to Cuba and it was awful. He went to North Korea and it was awful. At one point he's making his atheist arguments, and he's on Fox News and he says, "Not only do I argue that God does not exist, I argue that God's existence is not desirable. If God existed, it would be a lot like living in North Korea. It'd be a lot like living in North Korea. Someone would be watching you at all times, forcing you to do what's right and wrong. It's not desirable for God to exist." Well, that's Christopher Hitchens, right? And that's, social imperialism. And that's the platypus-affiliated society. That's how they see things, right? And, there's some people who interpret Marxism, have found a way to interpret Marxism as like peak first worldism, right? It's Marxism is the most first world chauvinist, ideology, and that's, social imperialism, whatever, right? And that's where people see continuity between Marxism and social and the neocons, which I'm going to talk about later in this live if I can get through all your super chats. Okay, all right. We talked about Lebanese civil war. Okay. The Progressive International, right? Yeah, that's an outfit that was formed recently. Bernie Sanders is involved with it, but it's mainly Keynesian economics, from what I understand. They're not socialist economics, but there's a Greek economist who's involved with them. And they're all about environmentalism, green technology, global warming, and they're all about that. And they're kind of an international, and they've been formed. And they're for Keynesian economics, kind of for a social welfare state. Bernie Sanders is promoting it. The president of Mexico is also, AMLO is kind of involved in promoting it. And it's an attempt to form like a new organization that will be kind of a counter to the new right in Europe, like Trump and Marine Le Pen and Brexit or whatever. It's like an attempt to form some kind of populist left. They're not Marxist though. But they have this Greek economist, I can't remember his name. AMLO in Mexico is aligned with it, even though he's more anti-imperialist and more tied to anti-imperialist countries. But regardless, he's aligned with it. Bernie Sanders is part of it. It's a new attempt to form a political axis internationally. We have the New Right, which is forming. And it's an attempt to have some kind of regroupment in terms of first world politics. And global warming is very important to them. So, yeah, that's what's being formed. And who knows? Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, is also involved in them. Jeffrey Sachs was the king of neoliberalism. He looted Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. He looted Bolivia and Latin America. But I guess if you listen to a lot of what Jeffrey Sachs says now, he's very critical of imperialism, and he almost sounds anti-imperialist now. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University is, I mean, people said this guy was a psychopath. People said this guy was demented. He was just such a libertarian. I mean, he gutted countries, destroyed millions of lives, but now, out of Columbia University, out of the UN, he's said good things about Nicaragua and their socialist government. It's weird. I don't understand it. I mean, maybe someday I'll go over to his apartment. He probably lives not far from here, right? I'm in Brooklyn. He's in Manhattan. Maybe someday Jeffrey Sachs will have me over his apartment and explain to me what the hell is going on. I don't understand it, right? So Jeffrey Sachs, if you're watching, have Caleb come over to your apartment and let's talk this over, right? I'll drink some. You can drink some of your whiskey or your fancy wine. I'll drink, orange juice or diet beverage, and we'll talk it over. You and me, Jeffrey Sachs. Let's do it. In fact, Jeffrey, if you want, you can come to my apartment. Jeffrey Sachs, you can come to my apartment. My wife and I would love to have you come over, Jeffrey. Jeffrey Sachs, Columbia University, neoliberal economist. People say you're the butcher of Bolivia. People say you killed millions of people in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. But now you're saying a lot of things that Caleb Maupin agrees with, opposing, critical of capitalism, critical of wars and stuff. Let's talk it over. Jeffrey, I'm talking to you. Jeffrey Sachs, let's do it. Come over to the apartment. Let's talk things over. It won't be on live. It'll be a private conversation. I won't record it. Let's just talk things over. You and me. I'm laying out the offer to you, Jeffrey. I'm offering my hand to you. Jeffrey Sachs, tell me what you're all about. Tell me what you're all about. So there you go. I have extended the invitation to Jeffrey Sachs. I want him to explain the Progressive International to me. There you go. The door is open. My door is open, Jeffrey. Let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation, Jeffrey Sachs. All righty. All right. All right. Technology, solar power, the Middle East, oil. Could it end wars? Yes. Yes, it could. I think that technology is the answer, right? People don't know this, but, during the Cold War, there was a plan from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wanted to irrigate the Middle East, make those deserts blossom, start growing food to feed people in parts of the world that didn't have access to food. And the Soviet Union was hoping that by industrializing and greening the deserts, they could actually lead that region to peace. And I agree with that. The road to peace in the Middle East is economic development. That's why Iran has worked so hard to economically develop. That's why the Ba'ath countries economically developed. That's why Arab socialism in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya. Yes, poverty and war, poverty and terrorism, poverty and drug trafficking are connected. When people are poor, these are things they do. But the road to peace is through economic development. And the road to economic development is technological development, right? We need solar energy, sure, yeah. We need to get off of fossil fuels because fossil fuels is a prison house for humanity. But nuclear power is part of the solution. Nuclear power has its problems, right? 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, but it's much safer now, and we need to make it better. Fusion energy is the future. They don't get the funding they need for their research. We could have a much more efficient energy source. And China is doing all kinds of amazing things on fusion energy right now. Not getting any press over here, but what China's doing and trying to figure out how we could get to fusion energy. If we could break out of the prison of fossil fuels, that would be such a big change for humanity. That's part of why China went to the moon and collected helium-3, which is a rare earth element that is used in fusion energy, right? So, technology, yes, is the answer. Technology is the road to peace. I'm all for it. We need economic development. We need poverty to be ended. And Roosevelt himself, he said that the dictatorship is made by hungry stomachs, and that's true, right? But economic development, this is scientific. This is Marxism, right? This is the understanding that people that want to just say, well, some people are just naturally inferior to others. The people in the Middle East are just naturally warlike, or the people in Latin America are just naturally poor. This is not science. Marxism explains why some countries are poor and some countries are rich. Marxism explains why wars happen. It's material economic analysis. People don't understand economics. And I've said before, you need to understand economics. Economics is the key to the world. If you can understand economics and the economic base, If you can do that, you can figure out how the world works. And China understands the economic base. People want to be critical of China. They're not spreading communism all over the world. Well, I'm sorry. They need to trade with the world, so they can't be destabilizing people to trade with them. But at the same time, China understands that the road to peace for humanity is economic development. They believe in historical progress. They believe in sustainable development. They believe in new technology. And absolutely. I mean, China understands the economic base. And yeah, we need to bring that Belt and Road to the Middle East. We need to revive some of the plans that existed at the time of the Ba'ath. We need to think about some of those ideas the Soviet Union had about how to develop the Middle East. The road is economic development. There you go. I'm going to take another drink of orange juice. Got 2 more super chats to get through. But keep it coming, folks. Keep it coming. Right? I don't have any place I have to be tomorrow. I even drank a diet beverage today. So it's going to be a long night. Yeah. Richard Trumpka, leader of the AFL-CIO, very good speaker. And he has a history of militancy. British imperialism is the weakest it has ever been. All right. All right. All righty. Richard Trumpka, right? He has a history of militancy with the miners' union, right? People talk about Camp Solidarity, the 1980s, and he built, kind of an activist group to support striking miners. Richard Trumpka, right? Big guy. He gave a great speech, a very, very good speech in 2008 about Obama and how disappointed he was that working class white people wouldn't vote for Barack Obama because he was black, and just condemning racism and how racism is an enemy of the working class. I wasn't a supporter of Obama, but the speech was very powerful, talking about how racism is, bad for everybody. It's the enemy of working people. Powerful stuff. Richard Trumpka. He's the head of the AFL-CIO. I don't know if he's in the DSA. For a long time, the head of the AFL-CIO was John Sweeney, and John Sweeney was a member of Democratic Socialists of America. I don't know if Trumpka is a member of Democratic Socialists of America. I think he might be, but I'm not sure. Great, Tyler. Glad you enjoyed it. But yeah, the other thing is that, you have to remember there were divisions in the AFL-CIO, right? There was Change to Win. And Andy Stern, who was the head of SEIU, Service Employees International Union, he and a number of other unions walked out of the AFL-CIO a few years ago. They formed this coalition called Change to Win. They broke with the AFL-CIO. They seem to be back on the same page now. But there was some ugly stuff that went down. Like, Labor Notes is this group that has a conference. It's run by... it's a leftist coalition. There's people in different socialist groups that are in it. They're like labor activists that are kind of disagreeing with the labor bureaucrats. And I remember one year they had somebody from, I think, the California Nurses Association was giving a speech. So SEIU members came and disrupted, were protesting against the speech. And that there's been some ugly infighting in organized labor in the last decade. I remember a couple of years ago, we saw, I think it was 5-6 years ago, we saw the AFL-CIO really just try to roll out their more radical face. They were all about protests and strikes and low-wage workers, and they were really, what people call the labor bureaucracy was really trying to put a left face forward. And that's good. I mean, that shows that people are ready to hear it. That shows that, that there's more of an appetite for socialistic politics and activism among the labor bureaucrats. It's good. But we know that a lot of the labor bureaucracy are not anti-imperialist. They're not, they're pro-war. And we know that ultimately socialism, workers controlling the banks, factories, and industries is the answer, not just electing Democrats. And what I was disappointed with is the socialist group that I was in. I remember at the time the AFL-CIO had this conference where they were putting forward their left-wing face, and they just applauded it. It was like, woohoo, great. And I was just shocked. There was no criticism. There was no how do we operate? How do we push anti-imperialism? It was just kind of applaud the fact that the labor unions, are putting forward a more left face. This is great. It's because of capitalism. Here's a quote from Marx explaining that labor unions will have to get more radical as the crisis gets bigger. And it was just, I remember I was sitting there and the leader of my party just gave this 40-minute, kiss ass speech, to the labor bureaucracy. It was pathetic. And I just sat there and I was just like, are you serious? No orientation, no, I mean, it was just pathetic. And I was sitting there blown away and thinking like, really? But really what he was saying was to the it wasn't even he wasn't even talking to those of us in the room. He was talking to the labor bureaucracy. Please hire me to run some of your protests. I'm really good at getting permits and cages. Please hire me to run some of your protests. That's what he was saying. It was kind of pathetic. But that's what happens, when I've made the joke before about communists in the United States. I've made the joke I've made the joke before. I've said, that, well, I'm not going to tell the whole joke. I have a whole joke I do. But regardless, like a lot of the communist groups it's like they've found something else to do. All right? Whether that's campaign for the Democrats, whether that's run the protests, cages, run the rallies, whether that's sell books, whether that's sell newspaper. They found something else to do. They found some other function, right? And they're not really trying to spread socialism. They're not trying to make a revolution. They're not trying to get to the masses. They found this function that they can do under capitalism, right? And it's funny because Lenin wrote about this. There's a very good pamphlet he wrote called Dare We Win. It's part of a larger pamphlet that he wrote, but it's Dare We Win. And he points out that was ultimately why they didn't have a revolution in Germany. In Germany, in 19 at the end of World War I, 1918, the workers were in motion. There was revolt going on, but the German Social Democratic Party was so well embedded into the capitalist system that they weren't willing to risk a revolution because the workers they'd overthrown the Kaiser. They were writing a new constitution. The government had fallen. The workers' councils were writing a new constitution, and the German Social Democrats insisted it was a capitalist constitution. And they killed Rosa Luxemburg and they killed Karl Liebknecht because they weren't going to allow, they were too afraid of the risk of revolution. They had built huge labor unions and huge choirs and huge Marxist institutes and all these. They had become such a machine under capitalism that the German Social Democratic Party was so big and so massive, and it had so much money and so much influence, that actually writing a socialist constitution and then risking what would have come afterwards, because the capitalists would have waged a civil war at that point. There would have been, Germany would have been invaded by, capitalist countries. Germany would have had to align with the Soviet Union. It was too much to risk. They didn't want to lose it all, right? And they were content with their socialist study groups and their legally recognized trade unions. And the German Revolution of 1918, it failed because the German Social Democratic Party was so big and so massive under capitalism. It had built such a big machine that it didn't want to risk it. And so when it came time, to write, they didn't want to risk it. And that was, Lenin talked about labor aristocracy, right? And that a lot of the upper layers of the labor bureaucracy, or the higher paid workers in the unions in Germany in 1918, they just didn't really want a revolution. They benefited, a lot of the higher paid craftsmen and all that benefited from German imperialism. They benefited from when Germany was an imperialist country, right? And they benefited from the exploitation of the Third World, and they didn't want to make a revolution in 1918. The majority of the workers in the German Social Democratic Party did, but the more influential ones that had more power, the labor bureaucrats, labor bosses, and they didn't want to make a revolution. And that's the problem, is that a lot of socialist groups, they become a group that carries out a function under capitalism, not a group that makes a revolution. And that's a problem. And that's the labor bureaucracy. The labor bureaucracy, right? It's great. It's there. It should be there. It represents workers on the job. It protects their rights and all of that. But ultimately, labor bureaucrats won't make a revolution. They're not going to make a revolution because they would risk everything. They would risk everything. Think about it. They would, if there's a revolution, they could potentially lose their $1 million jobs driving limousines and being the labor bosses. Think about it, right? And that's a problem. The labor bureaucracy and they'll, when they're pushed on, when they're under attack, they'll be more radical, and sometimes they'll be more radical than others, but they're not a revolutionary force. It takes conscious communists, revolutionaries, socialists, and Marxists to make a revolution. That the labor bureaucracy does what's in its material interest, right? And that's an important thing to remember. And that, Germany in 1918 is an example of that. And there's many examples of that. That, the labor bureaucracy, sometimes they're more revolutionary, other times they're not. But at the end of the day, they do what is in their material interest. And that it takes revolutionary Marxists with revolutionary ideology to make a revolution. And that, agree with me or disagree with me. But yeah, Richard Trumka, he has a history of militancy. He built Camp Solidarity with the miners. I look up to Richard Trumka in a lot of ways. Do I think he's going to lead us to revolution? No. And he would probably, if I sat there and said, do you want a revolution? He'd say, no, I want the wages of the people in my union to go up. Well, good. Good for him. These are important things to understand. You got to read the history of organized labor in the United States. This is all interesting. These are all interesting questions. So then I was asked, the last one on this first page here is about Brazil. Brazil is in a crazy situation because Bolsonaro is falling on his face. He has mishandled the crisis, the pandemic so badly. If you see how they're digging out graveyards in Brazil, preparing for death. He has fallen on his face. He said it wasn't real. It's unbelievable how bad Bolsonaro has handled this. 46% of the population wants him to resign at this point. And here's the problem. If you read The Economist, most of the imperialists want him out of there too. Trump likes him. That Trump faction likes Bolsonaro. But most of Western capitalism wants him out as well. Here's the problem. What's the strongest force within Brazil to replace him? Socialism. Right? Everyone knows the most popular leader in Brazil right now is Lula da Silva, the socialist president. And Lula da Silva, when he was president, he was a social democrat. He was middle of the road. And then he got imprisoned. They had to put Lula da Silva in prison to keep him from running against Bolsonaro. Right? They put him in prison, and he's now been released. They proved, we got the text, the trial was rigged, trumped up charges. He's released from prison. In prison, Lula da Silva became far more radical. He praised North Korea. And his party, the PT, the Workers' Party of Brazil, is far more radical than it was. They are a communist party now. And they're anti-imperialist to their core. They're far more radical. So the imperialists are in this weird spot. The Economist hates him. They can't stand him. He's a demagogue. He's mismanaging things. They want things to be stable. He's, in his own interests. He's tied to right-wing militias. They don't like him. But if Bolsonaro falls, he's going to be replaced with socialism. They don't want that. So they're in this hard place where he's like a pill they have to swallow. And that's often what fascism is, right? Hitler was the same way, right? The British, the Americans, they couldn't stand Hitler, but at least he killed the communists, right? That was their attitude, right? And that Bolsonaro, they don't like him. They don't like him. He's mismanaging Brazil. He's not working in their economic interest. He's not playing ball with them. He's getting all kinds of things wrong. Trump likes him. The Trump faction likes him. Likud party in Israel loves him. He's kissing up to Netanyahu like you wouldn't believe. But overwhelmingly, the international capitalist class hates Bolsonaro. But they know that the alternative to Bolsonaro is socialism. Lula da Silva comes back into power. The Workers' Party comes back into power. If that's the case, this middle-of-the-road stuff is gone. And I said this. I actually wrote an article way back when, 2013, 2014, basically predicting this, that middle-of-the-road line, that Lula da Silva and Dilma Rousseff had this middle-of-the-road perspective. They're like, well, we're going to be social democrats. We're going to be critical of the United States sometimes, but we're not going to go full-on with the Bolivarians. We're not going to be full-on with Russia and China. We're going to be middle-of-the-road. We'll do business with Russia and China sometimes. We'll do business with the United States sometimes. We'll have a lot of social programs. We're not going to nationalize things too much. We're going to be middle of the road. That line, right, didn't work. It fell. You can't do it, right? You can't do it for too long. You can't do it for too long. And the Workers' Party, the thing is, the Workers' Party, maybe you can do it a little bit. Modi can do it. Erdogan, Duterte can do it. But in Brazil, where the labor unions, where working class politics, where socialism is the basis of that government, If you have a working class Marxist government, you can't ride the fence, right? Now, Modi, Erdogan, Duterte, they're not socialists. They're not. Their base is not the working class. They're popular among the national bourgeoisie, if you will. But in Brazil, I mean, Lula da Silva came to power because of a populist socialist working class movement. Dilma Rousseff came to power because of a populist socialist movement. They took office and they rode the fence. They walked down the middle of the road. And I remember Obama saying, Lula da Silva, I like him. Now, he's socialist, but he's not like Venezuela. I like him. And they tried to ride the fence. Now, look what happened, right? Bolsonaro's in there. Lula went to prison. Now they realize you can't ride the fence anymore. You can't ride the fence anymore, right? And Lula da Silva is far more radical. And if he takes office, they're going to become even more socialist than before. And they're going to go more in the Venezuela direction, more in the Evo Morales direction. And so the imperialists are in this spot where they're going to tolerate Bolsonaro. And it's a contradiction. It's a big contradiction. My prediction is that Bolsonaro will fall, and I think that Brazil will go back towards socialism, but it's going to be difficult. I mean, the right-wing militias there, the racist groups, I think Bolsonaro will fall. I think that he will fall. My prediction is that Brazil might take a year or two, but I think Brazil will go back into the anti-imperialist camp, and it will be solidly anti-imperialist. It won't be halfway. It'll be in the anti-imperialist camp soon, but it'll be a struggle, right? And I think that the global economy crashing will have a lot to do with it. I think China's continue to rise, the way China's economy is already moving again. I predict that Brazil will be back, in the hands of anti-imperialists soon, but never say never. I mean, we don't know, but that's my prediction. But yeah, Bolsonaro is falling on his face. He's a failure, but the imperialists would prefer him over socialism, which is the alternative. And the Workers' Party, the Communist Party. I've been to Brazil. I actually shook hands with Michel Temer, who became president after Dilma Rousseff was forced out of office. He was revealed to have been working with the CIA, but I spoke at a conference of the Trade Union Center of Brazil. All right, did Lenin favor Trotsky? All right, writing it down. All right, cool. Okay. All right, British imperialism. Is it the weakest it's ever been? Well, it depends what you mean by British imperialism. I mean, the British state is certainly weaker than it's ever been right now. Brexit, the divisions, the British state is weaker. Scotland could soon be independent. People suspect Northern Ireland could soon be independent. The British state is weaker, but the financial entities that drive British imperialism are actually doing very well right now because of the pandemic. All their competitors are going to lose out, and they're, you talk about British Petroleum, BP, you talk about HSBC Bank. These forces, because of the pandemic, they're going to come out ahead. They're going to come out very strong compared to all the other capitalist corporations. The fracking companies are going under. Russia is suffering right now because the oil prices are low. But the London Stock Exchange banking elite, they're doing pretty well right now. The British state is weak, and we'll see what comes out of that. But yeah, I mean, we shall see. I think the British people, I think that's the difference. See, what we're seeing now, just like in the United States, in Britain, we're seeing the fact that the working class in the Western countries no longer gets the benefit out of imperialism they once did, right? It used to be that as imperialism was rising, the working class people in the Western countries benefited from it, right? And they got crumbs that bought their loyalty to empire. In the 1950s, people got houses and TVs and refrigerators, and they thought, wow, imperialism is great. And if we need to bomb Vietnam, sure. Well, America gave me a TV and it gave me a car, right? And the black community was more radicalized, but, the white working class, they bought their loyalty. Well, now we see the standard of living declining in the Western countries. And people in Scotland are saying, hey, we've got a lot of oil here, and we want free college still, and we want free healthcare. We don't like privatization of the NHS. And they're saying maybe we should be independent. People in Northern Ireland are saying similar things, right? The Irish question is once again being revived. Sinn Féin is getting stronger in Ireland itself. I mean, again, the living standards in the UK are dropping. We had Brexit and all that. And the British working class is not benefiting from imperialism. So, the British imperialist state is having to deal with this. You saw the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. We now have the Workers' Party with George Galloway. So it's complicated. It's complicated, right? And that Western countries are destabilizing. Same for the United States. Same for Britain. The Western countries are destabilizing. Working class people are not benefiting from empire anymore. They're starting to develop some layer of class consciousness. Things are changing. I wouldn't say British imperialism is the weakest it's ever been. I would say that things are changing. That's what I would say. And that yes, the way British imperialism rose to power, same with the United States, they depended on that labor aristocracy. Before we get to Lenin and Trotsky, I'll actually tell you about that. If you want to understand the aristocracy of labor, have you ever read The Dictator's Handbook? If so, what's your opinion on that theory? I'll talk about that. I haven't read it. Dictator's Handbook. All right. You know, if you want to understand British imperialism, there's actually a children's book that I would recommend by Rudyard Kipling called How the Elephant Got Its Trunk, or The Elephant's Child. And it's a children's book that was written. Rudyard Kipling was like the imperialist, right? And all throughout his writing, he's making the point that the way the working class people of Britain can redeem themselves, can get some respect in this world, is by being imperialists. He has a poem about redcoats, and it's this poem that talks about, a redcoat, that's somebody who wore the British Army uniform, being kicked out of a restaurant because, oh, he's a worker, he's a working class guy, and how he feels just, shamed. You know what I mean? It's all about how Rudyard Kipling, right? And it's the Jungle Book and all of that, and it's all about colonizing India, colonizing Africa. This is how the white people of Britain can redeem themselves. He wrote, "Take up the white man's burden, bring up the best ye breed," which was a poem to the American people trying to convince them to colonize the Philippines. And that was kind of the essence of imperialism. Cecil Rhodes, who Rhodesia is named after, Zimbabwe, before it won its independence, was known as Rhodesia, after Cecil Rhodes. And Cecil Rhodes, he wrote an article or a speech. He said he was in the East End of London and he saw the unemployed protesting. And it was just a cry for bread, bread, bread. And on the way home, he pondered the importance of imperialism. In order to avoid a civil war, we must become imperialists. And that the rise of British imperialism was about stabilizing British society. In Britain, you had the Chartists, you had, socialist groups, you had a huge working class movement. And it was about sending the British working class to Africa, to India, to Asia, to be overseers and bosses. It was about, bringing super profits home to stabilize society. The way imperialism rode high was with the creation of an aristocracy of labor, of a layer of the working class that was more prosperous. And Rudyard Kipling wrote this book called The Elephant's Child for children, right? And again, you want to talk about racism and all of that. It's like, it's clear he made it up, right? It's not an African traditional story, but he's telling it as if it's an African traditional story. That's offensive in and of itself. But, the story is, right, it's called, How the Elephant Got Its Trunk, or The Elephant's Child. The story is that this elephant, this baby elephant, is always asking his relatives questions. He's got insatiable curiosity. So he's always asking his relatives, annoying questions. And they're always spanking him for doing it, right? This is the story. And he keeps asking them, what does the alligator eat for dinner? And they keep spanking him for asking the question. So finally, this baby elephant really wants to know what the elephant eats for dinner. So he goes down to the river. And the alligator takes hold of his nose, and they have this kind of tug of war. And then he gets this big, long trunk. But then he goes back to his relatives, and they no longer can spank him because he's got this big nose, and he can spank them back with his big trunk. And it's supposed to be this children's story. It's supposed to be cute and funny. But the message being that, the British working class is getting kicked around in Britain. It's being degraded and humiliated and exploited by the British bosses. But they can go down to the river. They can go to Africa and Asia, and they can get into a fight with the colonized people, and they can, kick around the colonized people, and then they'll come back, and no one will mess with them. They'll have proved themselves. They'll prove that they're tough. They'll be able to spank them back. That's Rudyard Kipling, right? That's the message. That's the message of Rudyard Kipling, and it's not just that work. And a lot of his writing, his poetry, the white man's burden, the redcoats thing, it all comes across. That's Rudyard Kipling. And it's labor aristocracy. It's this notion that white workers in the developing world can gain dignity and respect by being imperialists, by being fellow travelers in imperialism. And that's what made British imperialism strong. And later, it's what made Western imperialism, or American imperialism strong, right? It's that white working class, that layer of Americans that said, "My country, right or wrong." It's the hard hat riots, right? A few days after the Kemp State massacre, you had guys in hard hats and with baseball bats and weapons go beat up anti-war protesters. It's that kind of like we are going to get respect in this world by being part of the imperialist. By being part of imperialism and by being tough fighters for imperialism. The people who, maybe we get kicked around by police, we get our wages, kicked around, we lose our incomes, but by gosh, we're gonna go, kill Vietnamese people. We're gonna go colonize countries, and then we're gonna get some respect, right? That's the logic of imperialism. And imperialism could hand out some crumbs, right? We saw a big working class in the Western countries, a big, prosperous layer of the so-called middle class workers, right? That's how imperialism stabilizes itself. Right now, imperialism is in a state of decay, and the living standard in the Western countries is dropping. And so as a result, the Western countries are becoming unstable because the basis of their empire, the basis of stability in the West, was labor aristocracy. They don't need a labor aristocracy anymore, right? They don't need white workers to work in those steel mills anymore. They don't need people in the auto plants. Technology is getting rid of the labor aristocracy more than anything. It's not just globalization. Sure, outsourcing, fine, it's a real thing, but it's mainly technology. They just don't need. They just don't need. I can't comment on Chile right now, but I see you're desperate for an answer. But they just don't need a labor aristocracy, and so that transition. Yeah. Okay. So British imperialism. All right. Did Lenin favor Trotsky? It's interesting. There's Lenin's testament, which was leaked. Right. It was this last will or testament of Lenin, and it condemns both Stalin and Trotsky. It says that Stalin is too rude to lead the Communist Party, but it condemns Trotsky as a windbag. It really speaks pretty nastily about Trotsky also, and it really speaks to his faults. That's a big thing that Trotsky has pointed out because it was like a big revelation. They revealed Lenin's testament. They showed that Lenin didn't like Stalin. It's true. Stalin had apparently called up Lenin's wife and been really rude to her, on the phone, and like demanded to speak to Lenin and been really nasty and threatened her or something like that. That happened. And Lenin was quite upset with that. And he said that Stalin was too rude, meaning that Stalin had this, he was he came from a working class background. His father was a bootmaker. He grew up in a small village, and he was a guy who used to rob banks for a living. I think he had a deformed foot, if I'm not mistaken, and he was known to get angry. He would shout in meetings. Many people would say, "Oh, he's deaf in one ear. He's deaf in one ear." He wasn't deaf in one ear. He would get fired up. And Stalin, he was a very good orator. He was known for, but he would do kind of crass working class comedy. And Stalin had been in the seminary school. He'd started out trying to be a priest, and he knew religion, and he'd learned to read and write because he was in seminary school learning to be a priest. And then, and that's how he became a Marxist. Stalin's a fascinating figure, but yeah, Trotsky was more from the milieu that Lenin was from, right? Trotsky was middle class. His family were landowners in Ukraine. Lenin's family were also middle class, and they went into exile. Lenin and Trotsky spent a lot of time in exile. They both wrote a lot. They did a lot of writing pamphlets and polemics against each other. And until July of 1917, Lenin and Trotsky didn't get along with each other. Trotsky, he rejected Lenin's call for a party of new type and formed the Bolsheviks. He said he wanted to form something called the August Bloc and have like a radical faction within the Menshevik Party, the August Bloc. And Lenin said they needed to form a new party, the Bolshevik Party, a party of new type. Trotsky didn't agree with that. Trotsky had the theory of permanent revolution, which is what Trotskyism is all about. Harpal Brar, one of the great points that he makes is that Trotskyists don't know about the theory of permanent revolution. The theory of permanent revolution is the basis of Trotskyism. That's what Trotskyism is about, the theory of permanent revolution. And it's unbelievable that, So many Trotskyists, they've never heard of the theory of permanent revolution, or they just say, well, it just means you should have revolution all over the world. That's not what it is. That is not what the theory of permanent revolution is. The theory of permanent revolution is the idea that you can't have a revolution in the developing world, that impoverished countries can't have socialism because they're too poor. And so the only way socialism, the only hope for socialism is to spread to the Western capitalist countries. That's the theory of permanent revolution. That's what it is, right? That Russia, China, Japan, India, well, I guess not Japan, it's kind of a developed country, India, African countries, Latin American countries, if they have a socialist revolution, they should just act as permanent holdouts in the global struggle to seize the West because they can't build socialism on their own, that they just have to be temporary holdouts. It's the theory of permanent revolution. And Lenin rejected that. And he actually said the opposite of what Trotsky said. Trotsky said that all that matters is the West. Germany, Britain, France, the United States, they're the only countries that it really matters if there's a revolution. If there's a revolution in a developing country, doesn't matter because they're too poor. They can't build socialism. Whereas Lenin says the opposite. In his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he says the revolutionary energy at that time is in the East, and that it's going to be fights for national liberation. The countries in the colonized world are going to be fighting for their independence as a country, and that the working class will lead the revolutions in those countries, right? That people in Africa are going to want to have an independent country, and the only way they can do that is for the workers to rise up because the capitalist class is going to be too weak, right? So that it's the opposite, right? That the revolutionary energy is in the developing world. That's what Che Guevara said as well, right? And Trotsky said New York City was the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forward. Lenin writes that the wind is blowing to the east. The revolutionary wind is blowing to the east. That's Lenin. He predicts, he basically predicts the Chinese Revolution. He predicts the Bolivarianism. I mean, Lenin says it's going to be the impoverished colonized countries that have socialism first. That's how it's going to be. He predicts that, right? Before the Russian Revolution even happens, he has the understanding economically. That's where the revolutions are going to happen. Trotsky, even after the Russian Revolution happens, even after there's all these things are happening, he still can't get through his head. No, all that matters is the West. And then the most clear disagreement that Trotsky had with the Communist International was over China. So much so that when James Cannon, the leader of American Trotskyism, was expelled from the Communist Party USA, he was on trial, and they had the head of the publishing company testify against him. They said, has he bought books on Trotsky? They said, no, but he's bought every book on China, and everyone knows that China is a Trotskyite subject. That's in James Cannon's memoir, right? He describes that. He makes fun of it. But why was China a Trotskyite subject? If you read Trotsky's critiques of the Communist International, it's all about China. And what is Trotsky's position on China? His position is that the communists should not have aligned with the KMT. Right? There's this mass movement in China, people rising up all over China, fighting for a new independent China. They're fighting for independence, democracy, and the people's livelihood. Right? People's livelihood is widely understood to be socialism. It's like Chinese Baathism or something like that. It is a revolutionary anti-capitalist current in Chinese society. It's not Marxist, right? The leader of it, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, is a good friend of Lenin. He wants to join the Communist International. Lenin says, well, you're not a Marxist, so you can be an observer. He's an observer of the Communist International. The KMT is getting its military training from the Soviet Union. All of their generals are going to the Soviet Union for military training. And Trotsky, in his mind, no, we can't support this. He wants the Chinese Communist Party to be the Spartacist League. He wants them to go expose this phony counter-revolutionary movement, KMT, screw you, you're not real communists, we're the real communists, you, KMT. This mass movement of millions of Chinese people who are becoming anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist. The communists joined it and were a well-respected faction. Their party grew to millions, but Trotsky, no. He wants them to be sectarian and hostile to the KMT. And then, right, after the communists have joined the KMT, they've recruited millions of people to join them. And then there's a turn in the KMT, and Chiang Kai-shek starts working with the Western capitalists, starts killing communists, right? At that point, Trotsky announces that it's the communists' fault. It's the communists' fault that Chiang Kai-shek is killing them because they joined the KMT. They should have been hostile to the KMT from day one. That's ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Trotsky is an ultra-left, and if you read Trotsky's writings on China in the 1930s, right? In the 1930s, the time when the Red Army, Mao's army is like the hero of the world for fighting the Japanese invaders, right? Right? When Mao is in the countryside building this peasant army that's doing all these amazing things. The book Red Star Over China is like a bestseller where Edgar Snow is describing all these heroic things that Mao is doing in the countryside. Trotsky writes about it. Oh, they're not real revolutionaries. They're peasants. They're a bandit army. Trotsky was a first worldist. He was a self-hating Russian. A self-hating Ukrainian, I guess. He wanted to be a Westerner. He wanted to live in New York City. He lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He wanted to be in New York City. He wanted to be in London. He wanted to be in Paris. He wanted to be in Vienna. He was ashamed of the third world. He didn't think the third world would make a revolution. And deep down, he felt like the people of the third world were rabble. Right? They were peasants. They were uneducated. They were illiterate. They were anti-Semitic. He thought the third world people were ignorant rabble. He loved the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's who he loved. He loved the hippies. He loved the protesters. He loved the dissident elements. He loved Sigmund Freud. He loved anarchists. He loved, the people sitting in cafes in Paris arguing about who was the most revolutionary. That's where Trotsky was at home. He was at home among the intellectuals, and that's what Trotsky was about. He wasn't a populist. He was part of that revolutionary intelligentsia, that current that has cursed socialism. Thank you for the super chat. But that's the problem with Trotsky. And I thank you, Joanne. I appreciate it. Alrighty. Dictator's Handbook. I've never read that book. Do I agree with it? Well, I've never read it. I don't know what it's about. This whole thing we learn in school about dictators. It's like this person is a dictator, right? And the reality is there's no country in the world where one man has absolute power. That's not the reality. There may be somebody who's the face of a police state, right? That happens. You have a charismatic individual who's like, Franco in Spain, or Hitler or Mussolini, who's like the front man for a police state. But even they don't have absolute power. They represent a strata. They represent, a bureaucracy, a section of their own ruling class. So it's not that simple. And I urge people to stay away from that kind of primitive thinking. But there you go. What else is on people's minds tonight? I got a couple other things we can talk about. But I'm an open book if you want to send me more super chats. I'm just having a good old time here. Almost done with my orange juice. We can keep going. Not in any rush to get anywhere. Corona streaming. We're sitting here Corona streaming. We're having a great evening. There's new people here. Welcome to the new people. Welcome. I know there's a lot of people who've started to join these conversations. I see Erin Sky says, so are we. I'm glad. This is a community here. I can't tell you how much I value the ability to come on here. Ramiro is with us. Shout out to you, Ramiro, out in LA. I can't tell you how much I value the ability to come on here and just chat politics with you all, shoot the breeze. Is the U.S. government telling the truth about 9/11? Okay, we'll talk about that. All right. But yeah, there's so much to, so much pleasure comes out of this. This is really, I live for this. I could do this a lot more. It's great. I've been doing a lot more of these lives. You all are here. New people, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Be part of this community. You don't even have to agree with me. There you go. 9/11. Here's what I say about 9/11. And again, you got to walk here with caution. Because, there's a lot. First of all, let me back up. All right. So what they call 9/11 truth is majority opinion worldwide. Yeah, that sounds shocking to you in the United States, right? In the United States, it's like 1 in 3 people, maybe 1 in 4 people thinks 9/11 was an inside job. That's pretty big. But if you go to Africa, you go to Latin America, you especially go to the Middle East, it's majority opinion. The majority of the people in the Middle East, in Africa and Asia, they think 9/11 was an inside job. You talk to them, they say it was the U.S. government that did it. They say it was George Bush who did it. They say it was Israel that did it. Outside of the United States, outside of the Western countries, outside of Western Europe, 9/11 conspiracy, what we call 9/11 conspiracy stuff, is mainstream. Right? Here in the United States, it's more prevalent than you would think. In mainstream media, they just kind of laugh it off like it's crazy. They've done polls. I mean, it's, you're talking 20% of the US population, maybe 25%. Some of these polls, it's, there's more people that support, 9/11 truth than support a lot of presidential candidates. I mean, a lot of these candidates in the primary, Andrew Yang never got like 1% of the vote. Far more people believe in 9/11 truth stuff than believe in Andrew Yang, but he was all over national TV, but it's kind of taboo. So I'm going to be careful here, because the thing is, you never want to say anything you don't know. Right? If you don't 100% know and believe what you're saying, you don't say it. All that I 100% know about 9/11 is that there are some things about the official story of 9/11 that don't make sense. That's all I know. That's all I know. That is all I know. That's it. And I can't say more than that. Right? I can't say the U.S. government did it because I don't know that. I can't say Israel did it because I don't know that. I don't have enough evidence to declare that. I don't know what happened on 9/11. I know that 2 planes hit the World Trade Center. I know that the Pentagon was hit. These attacks happened. And I'm told that they were done by guys with box cutters, and that was it. It was 19 hijackers and Osama bin Laden and some Al-Qaeda people, and that was it. But there are some questions. Okay? There are some things about the official story that make me go, For example, NORAD. Right? We know about NORAD, right? It's this Air Force group that's supposed to protect our skies. Where were they? I mean, they were having a drill that day. How did Al-Qaeda know that they were having a drill that day? Are we to believe that Al-Qaeda just magically, it was all just bad luck? They just picked that day to have their drill? It just happened to be the day Al-Qaeda was planning to do their thing? I don't know, right? People talk about, Fidel Castro wrote a column about the Pentagon and how, where's the plane? I don't know, and people said, why is there only one video of the plane? It took them 2 years to release the video of the plane hitting the Pentagon, and then they released only one angle of it, and it was after 2 years? I don't know. I don't know. Here's another question. Why did Al-Qaeda attack the United States? I mean, Al-Qaeda was an ally of the United States against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda was trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein. Al-Qaeda was trying to overthrow Bashar Assad in Syria. Al-Qaeda was trying to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. Where is Al-Qaeda not on the side of the U.S. government, right? Al-Qaeda is based in Saudi Arabia, which is like the U.S.'s biggest ally in the Middle East, right? Why in the world would, after decades of U.S. support and U.S. backing them and training them and giving them weapons and helping them fight all the socialists and revolutionaries and Baathists, and after all of that, why would Al-Qaeda go turn around and attack the United States? What, I mean, are they just that crazy? Maybe. I mean, I'm not saying I don't know enough. I'm telling you that there are some things about the official story of 9/11 that don't make sense to me. That's all I can say. When people start trying to tell you what actually happened, they start saying things, well, it was actually radio-controlled airplanes, and actually, stop. You don't know that. You don't know that, so don't say it. Don't say it if you don't know it, right? If you don't know something, don't say it. Don't say it if you don't know it. That's my opinion, right? Don't say it if you don't know it, right? I look at the official story of 9/11 and I go, right? And now we have the 28 pages about Saudi Arabia, the redacted pages. They weren't actually from the 9/11 Commission report. They were from this earlier thing. There are 28 redacted pages about Saudi Arabia. They finally came out right before the 2016 election. Look at the 28 pages. Whoa. Osama bin Laden's relatives were working at Saudi embassies. The hijackers were in touch with Saudi officials. They did a dry run where some people seized a cockpit on the way to Saudi Arabia. I mean, Look at the 28 pages. Right. All right. Shah of Iran, says Joanne. All right. Yeah, I see that about, Shah of Iran. Right. Yeah. It's pretty weird. Pretty weird. I mean, it's pretty weird. There's some stuff about 9/11 that's pretty weird. Building 7. A lot of people are tweeting out Building 7. I see that in the chat. Yep. Pretty weird. Pretty weird. But is it possible? Is it possible that there was more to it than we know? Is it possible? That's for you to decide. I have questions about the official story of 9/11, but I'm not going to say more than that. Because if you say more than that, no. I mean, you lose it. All right. So Joanne is asking about the USA denying the Shah of Iran. Yeah, that was Jimmy Carter, right? That was the Carter administration. And the Carter administration had been utterly humiliated, right? Their handling of the Iran thing, they had done so badly. And the Carter administration was trying to save face. The USA had been backing the Shah of Iran, a brutal dictator. They'd trained his Savak secret police to torture people. The Shah's regime was horrendous and murderous, and there had been this uprising that no one saw coming, and all of that, and the USA was being hated. I mean, death to America, right? I mean, it was being hated because it had, it had been the regime that had backed up the Shah, and Jimmy Carter was trying to save face, and that's what that was about, and the Shah, I think some of his final interviews, he starts blaming Israel for everything and talking about Israel lobby controlling everything. And what people don't realize is, I mean, he was the Shah of Iran, but, the Saudis think that. If you'd watch Saudi television, I mean, that kind of narrative that Israel rules the world, that everything is secretly a plot by Israel, and not just Israel, but a certain ethnic group and all of that, that's very, that viewpoint, right? Anti-Semitism, basically. Right? That the world is just run by this evil conspiracy of a certain ethnic group. That simplistic, childish thinking is really common in the Middle East. It's really common in Eastern Europe, and there's nothing remotely revolutionary about it. The stupidest people in the world believe that garbage. Okay? The Shah of Iran, right? I mean, he's been overthrown in the revolution, and his last interviews before he's killed, he's saying, "Oh yeah, what's the Israelis, the Israel conspiracy?" I mean, get over that. Okay? August Bebel, who was a very famous socialist in Germany, he said, anti-Semitism is socialism for fools. And it is. It is, I mean, I swear, there are some people who are just not smart enough to understand all the stuff that we're talking about on here, right? We're talking about economics, we're talking about class struggle, we're talking about, politics and all of that. And there are some people who just sit there, it's this other ethnic group, my ethnic group is being, and they can't think beyond, like, it's tragedy. I mean, they're just so, like, they cannot bring themselves to think with any level of depth, right? And they just sit there and, it's the Jews. It's like, come on, really? That's and ethnic hatred, primitive, barbaric ethnic hatred, tribal thinking, right? The people on the other side. I mean, I'm sorry, every place I've ever worked, every office, right? Well, not now, but when I worked at an insurance company, before that, when I worked at another insurance company, before that, when I worked in Cleveland, every like regular job I've ever had, there's always the people on the other floor, or the people in the other department, or the people in the other office. They're a bunch of assholes, and the bosses don't understand that we're the ones who do the real hard work, and those guys are a bunch of freeloaders. And there's the people in the other department, the people on the other floor, the people in the other building, the people in the... It's the stupidest thing. And the boss, always, when the boss is visiting you, he's on your side, right? Oh, I understand. I'm going to crack down on the people on the other floor, the people on the other department, the people in the other building, the people, and then he goes over and talks to them. Those people, it's stupid. It's this tribal thinking. It's this, my group, my ethnic group, my religious group, Italians are mistreated by Irish, and it's just, anti-Semitism is just an amped up version of that. No depth whatsoever. and just primitive bigotry. Not helpful. Not helpful. Anti-Semitism is not helpful. It's not helpful. It's led to lots of hate crimes, the Holocaust, mass murder. It's a way to avoid talking about class struggle, right? It's a way to avoid talking about class struggle, right? If the problem isn't capitalism, the problem is just this ethnic group, well, we just get rid of them. We just commit genocide and mass murder against them. Everything will be fine. Well, no, everything's not going to be fine, right? And first of all, genocide and mass murder is horrendous, number one. And number two, the problem is capitalism. It's not some ethnic group, okay? It's not, I mean, bigotry, racism, tribal thinking is not good. I really hope that I'm not sounding repetitive. I feel like I'm stating the obvious, but this kind of crap is all over the internet. It's all over the internet. Does Israel play a negative role in the world? I think so. I think Israel plays a very negative role in the world. But Israel doesn't represent all Jews. It clearly doesn't. I think the Vatican plays a negative role in the world, but all Catholics I wouldn't put into that category. There's a lot of Catholics in Latin America that are socialists and revolutionaries. It's this simplistic thinking. Anti-Semitism is socialism for fools. I urge you to get past anti-Semitism. If you're anti-Semitic, try to be smarter than that. Try to think deeper, right? Try not to resort to primitive, barbaric, bigoted thinking. Try to actually understand economics and materialism. That's my advice. Hate me for saying it or love me for saying it. And I'm not trying to gain any points with anybody. I have gone to Iran to speak at anti-Israel conferences, so I am not carrying water for Israel here. I'm just telling you, no one is more critical of Israel than me, okay? But I've gone all the way to Iran. I've risked my life on a ship. I am somebody who is not loved by Israel and the Israel lobby, okay? I'm just telling you that if your analysis of the world is the Jews, you're very primitive in your thinking, and it's very dangerous. That kind of thinking leads to awful things. Some of the most amazing communist revolutionaries I've ever met are Jewish. That is the truth. There was a woman in Cleveland, an older woman in her 80s. She was Jewish. She taught me everything I knew about Marxism. She was very anti-Israel. And that the World Zionist Organization saw Marxism as its primary enemy. I bet you didn't know that. But the World Zionist Organization actually said that its main enemy was Marxism, because Marxism encouraged working class solidarity. It wasn't trying to preserve a Jewish national identity. So just get past all of that. I don't know why we're talking about that. What else is on people's minds here tonight? What else is on people's minds? What else is new? What else is new, folks? What else is on people's minds? Could you talk maybe about how Britain still has an effect on Hong Kong's educational curriculum? I didn't know that, but it doesn't surprise me. I believe that. I believe that 100%, and when you see the Hong Kong protesters out there with their British Empire flags and, saying that they're civilized. We're not like the rest of the Chinese people. We're more civilized. See, we were part of the British Empire. It's disgusting. Disgusting stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Is Trump more or less anti-Bolivarianism than former U.S. presidents? Well, that's the thing. I think that Trump wants to have a confrontation with the Bolivarian countries. He wants to have a confrontation with the Bolivarian countries to win votes in Miami, to sell weapons for the military-industrial complex, and to look like a hawk. But in reality, Obama was more of a danger to the Bolivarian countries. I'm just being real with you. I think that Obama, his strategy was to kind of use soft power manipulation, gradually seep U.S. influence into those countries, and that was his strategy. And we know now, it's been revealed. What was Obama doing when he went to Cuba? What was that about? It's been revealed what that was about. They had a Cuban Twitter, all set up, a social media app. They were going to stage a color revolution in Cuba. And the Cubans exposed it. They infiltrated the plot. They revealed it, right? The idea was there was going to be more U.S. businesses opening up in Cuba, and then all of a sudden there'd be these people protesting, and they wouldn't be against communism. They would just be against dictatorship. They'd be for freedom, and it would be rumored that Fidel was about to kill them, and so then the U.S. troops would go in to rescue them. The whole game plan was written out there, and the Cubans were smart enough to infiltrate it and expose it. I sat in meetings at the World Festival of Youth and Students and listened to the Cubans show us slides of what had been planned. The whole Obama going to Cuba thing was all set up so they could have a color revolution. It was going to be right just like Libya. You'll remember Obama started sucking up to Libya right before the Arab Spring, right? And that there was relations, and Gaddafi called Obama my little African son. It was a soft power coup strategy. That's what they were planning to do in Cuba. Didn't work. Didn't work. They prevented it. And the other thing was Obama was hoping to prevent a Chinese military presence in Cuba, right? There was talk of maybe some kind of Chinese military base in Cuba, and the deal was we'll recognize it. And Trump hasn't rescinded that. Trump has maintained there is still U.S. diplomatic relations with Cuba, mind you. Now, there's been these weird chemical allegations of, spraying chemicals on people and sound weapons, and there's weird stuff going on in Cuba, but there's still a Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C., and they maintain that and Trump, but he's escalated. He's increased sanctions on Cuba. He has with Venezuela, he's been very aggressive, and that's because he wants votes in Miami, and he's kind of kissing up. It's interesting. The Netanyahu crowd, the Likud crowd, the Likudniks in Israel, and the Miami crowd, the anti-Castro fanatics, they walk hand in hand. Right, and the Shah supporters, the people that are part of the Shah, they all walk hand in hand, and they're not the mainstream view of imperialism. They're like a special interest group, and they're tied to the military-industrial complex. It's that soft power Jimmy Carter, Obama strategy. That's the mainstream view of imperialism. Stage color revolutions, destabilize with social media, get friendly to countries, and that's the strategy. And Trump, it's direct attack, invasion, theatrical bombast, just anything he can do to just kiss ass to those people. He doesn't care about the long-term interests of imperialism. He wants to make money for himself, for his supporters in the military-industrial complex. And so really, I think Obama is more of a danger to the Bolivarian countries. That said, though, because Obama's strategy is to do business with them, Obama is going to be less directly hostile in the short term. Right. And, he'll want more to increase trade, and the Bolivarian countries could benefit from increased trade in the context of Obama hoping that he can seep in U.S. influence. So it's complicated. I'm not going to tell the Bolivarian countries who they should be more friendly to or whatever. I'm just telling you it's a difference in strategy. Is it soft power manipulation and coups, or is it direct military threats and invasions? That's the difference. That's the difference. Kinky loves me for saying it. Well, thank you, Kinky. Needs to be said. That's the difference. At Black Agenda Report, they refer to Obama and the Democrats as the more effective evil. I think that's interesting. The more effective evil. But folks, before we go tonight, I actually had one more thing. If there's more super chats, I'll address them. Sam is just on the edge of his seat. He wants to hear it. And I want to talk about the Trotskyism and neocon link, because there's a lot written about it. It was really a really common thing during World War II. During the Iraq War days, there was a lot of people that pointed out, what is the neoconservative Trotskyite link? What is it? What is the neocon Trotskyite link? What's going on there? What's that about, right? People say, the neocons all used to be Trotskyites. So what is this about, right? And there's libertarians say, that's communist global revolution. What's going on here? So folks, I'm anti-Trotsky. I don't like Trotsky, but I know my trotology, right? Whereas a lot of people that are Cuban Americans ever get over their obsession with Cuba. Oh, okay. I know my trotology. And a lot of people that are anti-Trotsky don't. But here's the thing. So, we all know that Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union in 1927. or 1928, I believe, 1928. He's exiled, right? He forms the opposition. His followers are kicked out of the various communist parties. 1933, after Hitler comes to power, he establishes the Fourth International, which is this gathering of international Trotskyist groups. The U.S. wing of the Fourth International is the Socialist Workers' Party, SWP. It's led by James Cannon. And so you have this international movement of Trotskyists. Now, almost immediately, there's splits and breakaways, right? There's different factions. There's the Revolutionary League of Struggle and the Oilerites and the B.J. Fields grouping, and it's a really sectarian movement. Trotskyism always has this problem because the people who join them tend to be people who didn't fit in the Communist Party. They're the other main communist groups. So anybody who just doesn't get along in the Communist Party becomes a Trotskyist, right? And James Cannon tells the story of like some crazy guy who wore green suits and had a big long beard, and tried to join them. And it was just anybody in the world who, for whatever reason, didn't get along in the Communist Party, joined the Trotskyites. That was just how it happened. They joined the Trotskyites. Sam Marcy, the founder of Workers' World Party, even though he, was an anti-imperialist and was a staunch defender of the Soviet Union and all that, he ended up joining the Trotskyites also because he didn't get along with the Communist Party. And it became this kind of catch-all, right? And there's a million factions, right? But regardless, the main Trotskyist grouping in the United States was called the Socialist Workers' Party. So in the fall of 1939, something happened. What happened in the fall of 1939? You had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Why did they do this? Well, Nazi Germany was expanding territorially, and it was getting into a conflict with Britain and with France and with the United States. And the Soviet Union had gone to the United States, gone to Britain, gone to France, gone to other countries to try and form an anti-imperialist bloc. And the French had kind of gone along with it and then didn't support it. No other country had supported the Spanish Republic in its fight against fascism. So the Soviet Union was kind of all alone. And so, as an act of self-preservation, they formed this pact with Nazi Germany. It was not an alliance. It was a non-aggression pact. It was this understanding we won't attack each other. And there's this line down Europe, down the middle of Europe. And you can bring your troops over to one side and we can bring our troops over to one side. We never cross this line. That was what it was, the Pact of 1939, right? And immediately, American media, because Hitler was a rival, an enemy of the United States at that point, just went into overdrive, demonizing the Communist Party USA and communists in general and the Soviet Union for that pact. They said, oh, look, the communists have always said they're so anti-fascist. Those hypocrites, they just signed a pact with Hitler. And they started, Time magazine started calling the Communist Party USA communazis. Earl Browder, the leader of the U.S. Communist Party, was sent to federal prison on a passport violation. So that's what happened. So the Trotskyists are trying to figure out how they're relating to all of this. And of course, they mock the Soviet Union. They're against the Soviet Union. Trotsky technically says that the Soviet Union should have made the pact, but they carried it out wrong, right? Trotsky had to even write a song making fun of the Soviet Union about it. Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 1939, there's a Russian and a Prussian writing out the party line. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi, oh, we knew it for a fact. Pravda said it, we all read it, until the Stalin-Hitler pact. Now old Trotsky, once a Nazi, that was then the party line. But now a Nazi is hotsy-totsy, Trotsky setting British minds. And it was just making fun of the fact that, okay, that they zigzagged, right? Okay, the Soviet Union is doing business with the Nazis. Before they were saying Trotsky was a Nazi, now they're accusing Trotsky of being an agent of the British. Whatever, right? So it was like the Trots were making fun of the Soviet Union for this. So within the Trotskyist movement, there starts to be real debate about the Soviet Union. Now, Trotsky maintains that the Soviet Union is what he calls a degenerated workers' state. It had a socialist revolution, but it's been corrupted by a counter-revolutionary bureaucracy. The Soviet Communist Party is not revolutionary. It's this bureaucracy. It's corrupted the revolution, but it's not a capitalist country. It's not state capitalism. It's still a socialist society, socialist economic foundations of the economy, but it's led by a corrupt bureaucracy. That's Trotsky's position. But you get this grouping in New York City. The Trotskyist movement in New York City is huge. There's a big Trotskyist movement in New York City. And there's a group of people in the Trotskyist movement in New York City who just don't agree with it, right? And probably the most well-known among them is a man named Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman, who'd been a founding member of the Communist Party, founding member of Trotskyism, and he's just this big, well-known Trotskyist intellectual in New York City, Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman, along with Martin Aburn and James Burnham, they all announce that the Soviet Union is no good. Now, Shachtman says that it's bureaucratic collectivism, and it's this new social system. It's neither capitalist or socialist. It's this new social system, and Nazi Germany is just like it. James Burnham, he says it's state capitalist, right? Martin Aburn, I don't even know what his position is, but they announced they no longer support the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is no longer a workers' state, and when World War II comes, if there's a war, we don't support the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's intervention in Finland, we don't support that, right? We can't support the Soviet Union. So Trotsky writes a book in defense of Marxism, all kinds of essays and articles criticizing them and saying the Soviet Union is still a deformed workers' state. James Cannon, he writes an entire book criticizing the New York intellectuals, they're called, the New York intellectuals, called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, pointing out that this faction in New York City, Shachtman, Burnham, and Aburn, right, that they're not working class, they're middle class intellectuals, and they're anti-Soviet, right? They think the Soviet Union is their enemy, and they have this big fight, and it leads all the way up to the Socialist Workers' Party convention, the 1939 split in the SWP, and they expel all of them, right? They kick out the New York intellectuals. And so the New York intellectuals, right, and these are all these college professors, James Burnham, Max Shachtman, Sidney Hook. I guess Sidney Hook had not been in the Socialist Workers' Party, but he kind of a Trotskyist intellectual, was like friendly with it. All these people, Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, all these people are just, they're chucked out of the Socialist Workers' Party, out of the main Trotskyist group. So they form different groups: the Independent Socialist Club, the Workers' Party, the Independent Socialist Club, the Workers' League. I mean, they form all these different groups. They've all been kicked out, right? And they're all kind of centered around the idea that they no longer support the Soviet Union. And they lay the basis for a milieu of people that the CIA picks up to be their left-wing intellectuals in the 1950s. The Congress for Cultural Freedom. Irving Kristol, who was a follower of Max Shachtman, a good friend of Max Shachtman, Irving Kristol becomes the founder and the leader of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is the CIA program of distributing money to the synthetic left, to fake leftists all over the world, right? They set up Partisan Review magazine. They start printing the writings of Hannah Arendt and Susan Sontag. And it's the Shachtman group and the people kicked out of the SWP in 1939 who become kind of the big intellectuals who the CIA is promoting. And Irving Kristol is one of the most prominent leaders of it. Now, Irving Kristol, he's 50s, early 60s, he is Mr. Left-Wing. He's Partisan Review, Congress for Cultural Freedom. He's just this smart guy, this intellectual in New York City who has a magazine, and no, he doesn't know where the funding's coming from. We later find out it's the CIA. That's who he is, right? Keep in mind his son, right, Bill Kristol, is the editor of the Weekly Standard, right? But later, right, and some of them are in the Socialist Party. A lot of them start becoming conservative, right? In the Socialist Party, you'll remember the Socialist Party of the, there's the Socialist Party USA now, but it used to be the Socialist Party of America, the party of Eugene Debs. And it split in the early 70s. It collapsed. And you had one faction, Socialist Party USA, that were completely 100% against the Vietnam War. And those folks are now the Socialist Party USA. That's them. Then you have this other faction that's kind of against the Vietnam War, right? Kind of against the Vietnam War, right? Michael Harrington, who's the founder of DSA, Gloria Steinem, and they're kind of against the Vietnam War. They think the Vietnam War is not good policy. They want to negotiate. They're kind of against it, but they're not really against it. It's like they're not for withdrawal. Irving Howe, right, very prominent Trotskyist intellectual, they're kind of against the Vietnam War. I mean, it's good to fight the Stalinists, but it's a bad policy, something like that. And then you have this other faction called Social Democrats USA, and they are 100% in support of the Vietnam War. And they're neocons. That's the neocons. The neocons come out of that milieu. Max Shachtman in the final, he died in like the early 70s, but Max Shachtman, who was the leader of the split in Trotskyism, Max Shachtman, he supported the Bay of Pigs invasion because he said Stalinism in Cuba was the main threat. Max Shachtman supported the Vietnam War because Stalinist expansion in Vietnam, right? Max Shachtman, he's the link. And Max Shachtman is an embarrassment. He's an embarrassment. If you're a leftist in the United States, you never want to admit you had anything to do with Max Shachtman because he was a supporter of the Vietnam War, for Christ's sakes. He was a supporter of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was a State Department socialist, right? Michael Harrington, who was the protege, who was the founder of DSA, was the protege of Max Shachtman. Michael Harrington worked in the Lyndon Johnson administration. He was an employee of Lyndon Johnson. He was in the administration. He wrote a book called The Other America, Exposing Poverty. And he was very much part of the State Department. They used to call the Shachtmanites the State Department Socialists. The State Department Socialists, because they were socialists who worked in the State Department, and they had State Department foreign policy views, and they didn't deny working with the CIA. They were proud of working with the CIA. They didn't have any shame in it, right? Fighting Stalinism, that proves that they had no shame. Irving Howe, right? He was a leftist. He used to write articles in the New York Times denouncing anti-war protesters, saying the anti-war movement in the 60s was too radical. It was too pro-Stalinist. The anti-war movement is out of control, and I'm a socialist, but these anti-war protesters don't understand how evil Stalinism in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh is an evil Stalinist. That's the link. And the question was how supportive of the Vietnam War were you? And the ones that were very, very supportive of the Vietnam War, those are the ones that ended up becoming neocons. And then the Carter administration, that was really the turning point. Because when Jimmy Carter came in, he was about soft power, right? And, somebody else on the live pointed out there was a whole thing with the Shah and not giving him a visa. And, Carter, in many ways was about soft power. But you had a certain faction of these ex-Trotskyists, I guess you could call it. They're not Trotskyists anymore, like ex-Trotskyists, that were so anti-Soviet, so anti-Stalinist, that they supported Ronald Reagan. They thought Jimmy Carter was a coward. He was too soft on the Stalinists, right? Ramiro was talking about Carl Gershman, right? The head of the National Endowment for Democracy. Yeah, another one of these. He was part of the YPSL, the Young People's Socialist League. And it was this milieu of people. That's the link, right? They were with Trotsky until the Stalin-Hitler Pact. Then they were against the Soviet Union. And they're elitists. They're total elitists. If you read the obituary, and I quote this in my new book. I talk about all of this. If you read the obituary of Irving Kristol, right? They call him the father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol. His obituary in the New York Times talks about when he officially stopped believing in socialism. He'd been a leader of a Trotskyist group, but when did he really turn against socialism? It was when he got drafted into the U.S. military. And he says that he thought that the Americans who were in the U.S. military with him were barbarians, right? I can't build socialism with these people, he said, right? And he hated the other Americans he was in the military with. And he fought in the Second World War alongside all these Americans. He was from New York City, but he fought alongside Americans from Ohio and Pennsylvania and Texas and Missouri and places like that. And he thought they were a bunch of rednecks and hillbillies and barbarians, and he did not want to empower them. And he says that very blatantly. He stopped being a socialist because he hated ordinary Americans. And folks, I got to tell you, what did he do after he stopped being a socialist during World War II? He started running the CIA's synthetic left. That's what he started doing. He started running the Congress for Cultural Freedom program and manipulating leftists, right, to be anti-communist, anti-socialist. But that contempt for ordinary people, right? Trotsky was like that. That bleeds through all of Trotsky's writings. Trotsky would have tried to convince you he wasn't like that. Irving Kristol had no shame about it. But, that's the synthetic left. If you read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, you know, her whole message is that ordinary people, that Eichmann, there's nothing special about him. It's the banality of evil. Eichmann is an ordinary person. Deep down, ordinary people are a bunch of Nazis. That's the message of the book, right? It sounds like it's this nonconformity, and this is, conforming people are dangerous, and it's like if you've ever been bullied or if you ever felt like you don't fit in at school or whatever, it appeals to you. That's not what it's saying, though. You have to read it in context. The message is, deep down, Eichmann could be anybody. Deep down, ordinary working class people are a bunch of Nazis. So we shouldn't try to build mass workers' movements to empower them, because that'll lead to fascism. No. That'll be Stalinism. That'll be dictatorship. What we need is to emphasize freedom and individualism. That's what the synthetic left is about. You read Susan Sontag and her denunciations of and it's like they redefine fascism. To them, fascism isn't, an attempt to save capitalism by building a mass movement, Bonapartism. Oh, no. Fascism is when ordinary people get too involved in the political process. Ordinary people are dangerous, they're rabble, they're inferior, they're not as smart as us, and they're dangerous. And when they get involved in the political process, whether it's socialist Soviet communism or fascism, it's the same, right? Because the rabble are involved. We need to manage these people, we need to control them and just depoliticize them and push them out because they're dangerous. That's what the synthetic left and the neocons and the synthetic left, Susan Sontag, Hannah Arendt, Irving Kristol, another big neocon intellectual is Leo Strauss. That's what he believes, right? Leo Strauss, he would tell his students they were philosopher kings, right? And that they had to make, he loved Gunsmoke, the cowboy TV show, and he said we need to, program Americans so they think about foreign policy like it's an episode of Gunsmoke. Socialism, right? And even later, right? Participatory democracy and Tom Hayden, Students for a Democratic Society. The idea is to empower people, to bring people into the political process, to expand democracy by building a mass movement, in all the socialist countries, Venezuela, the Bolivarian circles, the socialist country, the Soviets, right? Committees to defend the revolution in Cuba, the Basij in Iran, right? And the Baath countries had community assemblies, the popular assemblies of Libya, right? China, they have the peasant associations, the community association. That communism and socialism is about bringing people into the political process, giving them an ideology, helping them understand dialectical materialism, and empowering them to take leadership. And that's what socialism is about. These people don't believe in that. The synthetic left are intellectuals who hate ordinary people. They think ordinary people are rabble. Ordinary people are dangerous, and when they get together and they form governments of action that fight for their interests, that's the scariest thing you can imagine. And the goal is no longer socialism. It's not popular power. It's not controlling the means of production. It's not a rationally planned economy. Oh, no. The goal is freedom. The goal is, alienation. I don't know. The goal is individualism. The goal is creativity. It's about controlling and containing the masses of people in order to protect the intellectuals. They're not that different than libertarians, honestly. It's a lot like Ayn Rand's Anthem, right? But if you read, George Orwell looks at the Soviet Union, a society that's empowering artists and writers, and is, the films of Sergei Eisenstein and things in art that had never been done before, and, classical music. The Soviet Union is this a beautiful society. George Orwell looks at it and he says, this is a boot stomping on the human face, right? This is the petty bourgeoisie announcing, our individualism is being taken away. That is the synthetic left. It's anti-populism. It equates the Soviet Union and it equates the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. It equates socialism with fascism. And it has contempt, just utter contempt for ordinary working class people. It sees ordinary working class people as the enemy. That's the essence of the synthetic left. It's anti-populism, right? And I'm glad people appreciate it. I'm glad people appreciate the message. And that's why we have to fight against it, because the left will lose if it's against populism. You can't be popular if you're anti-populist. We need to revive the real populist principles that built socialism at one point, right? We need a real left that believes in real populist principles. On that note, folks, it's time to say good evening. But we need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need a government that will take swift, dramatic action to fight for working families. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. While the danger of a new world war still exists, the people of all countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Always a pleasure, folks. Thanks for tuning in.